Welcome back to my video series exploring the differences between the theatrical and extended editions of The Lord of the Rings. This video is going to cover the changes made to the two towers, although I will also be considering how these changes impact various other narrative moments throughout the trilogy. I am going to be ranking each extended scene on a tier list, and what we are looking for in order to definitively say that the extended edition is superior to the theatrical edition is for as few scenes as possible to be ranked D tier or lower, as D is my tier that includes any scenes that make the film worse to any degree. Anything in B tier we can consider to be good scenes, and anything in A tier or higher is, in my view, a clear improvement over the theatrical edition. Quick disclaimer before we get stuck in, I am not prioritizing adherence to Tolkien's books, I am prioritizing what I think leads to the best possible cinematic adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, which was the same mindset taken by the filmmakers. Also, I want to quickly give two corrections from the Fellowship of the Ring. Flight to the Ford goes up to C tier. Yes, it is fan service, and yes, I prefer that it not be in the film, but as a few of you guys have pointed out, Sam is attempting to make sure Frodo remains conscious and focuses on something other than his immense pain. For this reason, I am going to bump Flight to the Ford up to C tier. I also made an error stating that Galadriel was the only elf able to detect magic in the theatrical edition, which is false, as Legolas also does so in The Return of the King. This doesn't affect my ranking, but I wanted to correct myself. Anyway, check out Part 1 if you haven't already, but with that out of the way, let's get stuck into the extended edition of The Two Towers and work out which version of the film is superior. Immediately following Frodo's flashback dream about Gandalf and the Balrog, we get our first brand new scene, Elven Rope. This scene establishes peril, and then undermines it in service of a colourful and sincere character moment. So the first thing this scene gives us is that it depicts the extreme danger posed by the environment, and shows that the path through Emyn Muil is not simple, nor is it safe.
An impassable labyrinth of razor-sharp rocks.
The hobbits encourage each other to keep going in spite of the danger, showing that they are continuing to rely on each other, and the fact that they are using Sam's elven rope clearly shows that Frodo needs Sam in order to complete his quest, and that Frodo wouldn't have got very far without Sam. Then Sam loses his footing, and a small box falls out of his pocketses, causing him to panic and shout for Frodo to catch it. Instinctively, Frodo does, but this causes Frodo to also lose his footing and take a little tumble off the cliff. Luckily for the free peoples of Middle-earth, however, it was only a couple of feet through the fog down to the bottom. There are a few moving parts to this, and some of them work, some of them, quite unfortunately, do not. Sam reveals that this small box contains seasoning, and that he intended to use this seasoning on roast chicken. Frodo finds this revelation amusing, given Sam's panicked reaction upon almost losing it. Sam greatly values this box of seasoning because he appreciates a good meal and he doesn't want to just eat lembas bread for months on end. And the fact that he is expecting to eat roast chicken anytime soon is adorably naive, which Frodo finds very entertaining.
It was done to try to see a little bit more of a lighter side to Frodo and Sam before the story got too grim. It does succeed in that. I'm pleased to have it back, because the Frodo that we see here at the beginning of the film is more similar to how Frodo ends up at the end of the film after he's travelled the journey that he's about to go on.
This is solidly character-driven, but what I question is that Sam wanted Frodo to grab the seasoning whilst traversing an extremely perilous cliff face when they explicitly cannot see the bottom.
Can you see the bottom?
This establishes a degree of peril. The stakes of the scene are that their lives are potentially in danger because of how high up they are, and the payoff involving the box of seasoning relies entirely upon these stakes. Sam yelling at Frodo to catch the box of seasoning, of course, puts Frodo's life in danger, because neither of them know how far the drop is. This relies on Sam believing that if Frodo does not catch the box, its contents will be lost due to the height of the cliff, which then directly calls into question why Sam wants Frodo to risk his life to catch the box. The writers, however, knew that the bottom of this chasm was just a couple more feet down, and so there would be no consequences for Frodo losing his footing, and so there would be no consequences for Sam yelling at Frodo to catch his box of chicken seasoning. As this was a split-second decision, Sam, of course, did not consciously weigh Frodo's life against a box of chicken seasoning and decide in favor of the latter, but as depicted, he did absolutely do this subconsciously, which I do not believe that Sam would do, given how protective he is of Frodo throughout the rest of the trilogy, and so this was likely not the intent of the writers. We are clearly meant to just skim over this due to the fact that Frodo only falls a couple of feet, and the fact that this feeds directly into a sincere character moment between the two of them. The only way around this is to suggest that Sam is so naive and inexperienced that he doesn't consider Frodo grabbing the box to be any kind of risk. And this would be fine, if not for the fact that they are literally rappelling down a cliff face where they explicitly cannot see the bottom. This would be like if, as a young whippersnapper, you were playing by the side of the road, and then out of nowhere an 18-wheeler comes blasting round the corner towards you. You accidentally kick your ball into the road, and your friend says, "Oh shit, get the ball, get the ball, get the ball." It would obviously be tremendously stupid to attempt to get the ball, because it doesn't matter how valuable or sentimental it is not worth the risk of being liquefied by an oncoming lorry. Sam and Frodo's bond is meant to be unbreakable, and so whilst the payoff for this scene is excellent, the mechanics by which we get to the payoff are certainly flawed. Anyway, on to the payoff.
It's very special, that. It's the best salt in all the Shire.
Frodo then agrees that the box is special, but not because of what it literally contains. Frodo values the box because it represents a little piece of home. This is a good piece of storytelling, because it calls back to the previous film and reminds the audience of the Shire, the Two Towers being the only film in the trilogy in which we do not actually see the Shire, and therefore this moment reminds the audience of why Frodo and Sam are doing what they are doing. However, this could absolutely have been done elsewhere, perhaps during a future scene involving food, such as either Sam complaining about lembas bread, or the scene where Sam cooks the rabbits into a stew. He could open the box of seasoning, Frodo could then ask what it is, and we reach exactly the same payoff, with them having brought a little piece of home along with them. The only thing that would be missing from this adjustment would be the amplified degree to which Sam values the box of seasoning, but I flatly do not think that Sam implicitly or explicitly valuing the seasoning more than Frodo's life, or being dumb to the point of not understanding why trying to grab something while climbing down a cliff is extremely risky, is at all in character, nor is it good storytelling. The fix for this is very simple. Don't have Frodo lose his footing, and have him notice the box instead of Sam. Have him catch the box, then continue to climb down, and realize they are basically at the bottom. Of course, the reason this isn't what happens is because it is more dramatic for Frodo to slip and fall, and the fact that he doesn't suffer any kind of injury or worse certainly gives the impression that the writers are manipulating their audience in the name of cheap and momentary drama. Frodo then tells Sam that they can't leave the rope because he is worried about someone following them. This foreshadows the reappearance of Gollum. Frodo is being very cautious and is expecting that Gollum will continue to follow them, which makes sense. After a simple tug, the knot comes free, and the rope falls down the cliff.
Real elvish rope.
We are not off to a particularly good start with the Elven Rope scene. It is unnecessary, it is not particularly good in its own right, and it is placed directly at the start of the film, therefore tanking the pacing by making the audience wait a further 2 minutes before the story actually starts. What it achieves could have been achieved elsewhere in the film. It contains questionable characterization for Sam, and the undercutting of tension is something that feels cheap and out of place within The Lord of the Rings. I will remind you that I love these movies to death, but that does not mean that they get a free pass. I think the Elven Rope scene is the weakest addition to the extended editions so far, and I am therefore going to place it at the bottom of D. Up next is an extension of the Taming of Smeagol sequence. We get a very quick shot of the hobbits taking shelter from the rain, and we see that Gollum has indeed followed them.
Another prefiguring of Gollum where we just wanted to build up tension before his arrival. All of this stuff was, things that we just did without when we cut the theatrical version, really just to try to get the time down to 3 hours.
This is a very insignificant change, as all it does is reveal to the audience that Gollum is here a few minutes earlier than in the theatrical edition, which you could say helps in terms of tension. However, Frodo already voiced his concern about being followed in the Elven Rope extended scene, and so these 20 seconds or so of added footage I don't consider particularly necessary. It also serves no mechanical purpose, as shortly afterwards, in both versions of the film, Frodo tells Sam that they are not alone, which he deduced given the distinct odour of a creature who has not showered in 500 years, plus the fact that he was of course expecting Gollum to follow them. After Frodo releases Gollum and orders him to lead them to the Black Gate, we have some extra footage showing Gollum's conflict.
The gate master says yes. Helm won't go back. Not there, not to him, but We swore to serve the master of the precious. No.
So this is a pretty major change to how Gollum is depicted in The Two Towers. In the theatrical edition, the first time we see Gollum arguing with himself is much later in the film.
Must have the precious. Master's my friend. You don't have any friends.
Until this point, Gollum is portrayed as, well, sketchy as fuck, but aside from the fact that he consistently refers to himself as us, there is no suggestion that Gollum actually has multiple personalities. This means that, in the theatrical edition, it is heavily implied that Frodo showing Gollum kindness and reminding him of his real name is what initiates Gollum's inner conflict and causes the Smeagol personality to emerge. If we look chronologically, provided we discount the Hobbit films, we only have 2 references to work with where we hear Gollum speak prior to his introduction in The Two Towers. The prologue to The Return of the King shows us the earliest point in Gollum's story, and the prologue to The Fellowship of the Ring shows us the latest. Gollum does talk to himself in both of these scenes.
We robbed precious. We robbed me so long. It came to me. Curse them. We hate them.
But in none of these scenes does he appear to argue with himself and simultaneously hold 2 conflicting beliefs. In this scene in the extended edition, however, Gollum does argue with himself, as he debates whether or not to keep his promise to Frodo.
They can't make us, but we swore to serve the master of the precious.
This change therefore means that, in the extended edition, Gollum having multiple conflicting personalities is just kind of the way he is. In the theatrical edition, however, Gollum is Gollum until Frodo calls him by his real name, Smeagol, at which point Gollum starts to remember who he was, and the Smeagol personality begins to re-emerge. My interpretation of this was that Frodo had initiated a form of inner conflict where Smeagol attempts to take control and eventually, metaphorically, banishes Gollum.
Leave now and ever come back.
Before this dynamic then shifts back in favour of Gollum by the end of the film. Rather interestingly, this is not the case in the book, nor is it the case in the Hobbit films, both of which clearly depict Gollum as having 2 distinct personalities that can change at any moment.
Oh, we knows, shut up.
Therefore, this extended scene is more in line with the book, however it also makes it impossible to read the character of Gollum as I just described. In the extended edition, Gollum already has multiple personalities, and so the presentation of the character instead suggests that Frodo's kindness emboldened the Smeagol personality that already existed to take charge, rather than prompting Smeagol to emerge, period. This isn't necessarily better or worse, more of an observation as to how it alters the audience's perception of Gollum, but I prefer how this is handled in the theatrical edition, as it better emphasizes the psychological effect that Frodo's kindness is having upon Gollum. Anyway, after arguing with himself, Gollum appears to freak out and try to escape, which prompts Sam to chase him. This helps to build the growing antagonism between Sam and Gollum, as he is seemingly proven to be right about Gollum mere moments after telling Frodo not to trust him.
If we let him go, he'll throttle us in our sleep.
Helping to establish Sam's suspicion and justify what Frodo perceives as paranoid behavior. Shortly afterwards, Gollum reveals that he didn't actually run off, and he leads them out of Emin Muil.
The extra footage here gives a lot more clarity to the concept of Gollum actually leading them out of these rocks. I kind of like the idea that he's become this really weird guide for them, which was lost a little bit, or certainly more obscure in the theatrical cut.
One other small thing to highlight here is Andy Serkis's voice work.
Gollum.
The voiceover for this extended scene was clearly recorded before Andy Serkis had fully committed to the hairball vomit vocalization he uses throughout the extended edition.
And this is the gospel truth. Whilst I was thinking and preparing and working on the character, my cat came into my kitchen and started coughing up a furball. I was thinking, well, this is really interesting as I'm watching it. And then he started to literally go like that. And I thought, well, that might be very interesting if that then suddenly became
Gollum.
Gollum's mannerisms being slightly different in this extended scene is purely a technical observation, and is similar to something like an inconsistency in visual effects.
The Gollum that you're seeing here is almost our prototype Gollum. When you see him in the Two Towers, he will look a little bit different to this. This was done, early, and we have since developed him and changed him slightly, so at some point we'll probably go and redo that shot there for some later DVD edition of the Fellowship.
So, whilst I would have liked for the audio team to use an alternate take or repurpose some ADR recorded at a later stage by Andy Serkis, I won't dock points for this inconsistency. Overall, The Taming of Smeagol is a good scene. The changes are, for the most part, character-focused. However, the problem is with how it recontextualizes Gollum's multiple personalities, and I do have a marginal preference for how this is portrayed in the theatrical edition, as the extended edition de-emphasizes the effect that Frodo's pity has upon Gollum, which then makes Gollum/Smeagol's own journey throughout the Two Towers less impactful. There is very worthwhile character information in this scene, such as the way it depicts Sam's distrust of Gollum, as well as Gollum's own indecision about whether or not to return to Mordor. But I can't place this one any higher than C, because I do think that it slightly detracts from the importance and impact of later parts of the film. Next up, we get an extension to the Uruk-Hai scene, which contains a decent bit of world building, establishes conflict between the Uruk-Hai and the Orcs, and also contains excellent character work for both Merry and Pippin. In the theatrical edition, the Uruks stop running because one of them catches a whiff of Aragorn's manly musk, they realize they are being tracked, and then they keep running. In the extended edition, the Uruks stop running because there are a bunch of orcs nearby that they were evidently supposed to meet.
You're late. Our master grows impatient.
The Uruks then reply that they don't take orders from orcs and that they will deliver the hobbits to their master, Saruman. There are two possibilities with these orcs, and if we dig in, one makes far more sense than the other. I'm going to quickly do that thing that I said I wouldn't do. I'm going to reference the book, because this right here is an example of book knowledge potentially making the film harder to understand, because it gives the viewer certain expectations. In the books, these orcs are explicitly from Mordor, and there is conflict between the Isengarders and the soldiers of Mordor. Someone watching the Two Towers with book knowledge will expect, then, that these orcs are from Mordor, which, given the surrounding context we get in the film, makes substantially less sense than the alternative. If these orcs are from Mordor, then this means that Sauron knew that Saruman had sent his Uruk-Hai out to grab the hobbits, which he could only know if Saruman told him, and Saruman would have no reason to do such a thing. It would also require that Sauron sent these orcs across Middle-earth in the time it took the Uruks to travel from Isengard to Amon-Hen and back, and I will remind you that the Uruk-Hai were specifically bred to be able to move in daylight and cover great distance at speed. This would also mean that when the orc says,
Our master grows impatient. He wants the Shire Rats now.
He is referring to Sauron, and that their intention is to take the hobbits all the way back to Mordor instead of Isengard. Alternatively, these orcs may have originally been from Mordor, but they are currently operating under orders from Saruman. This would require that Saruman sent these orcs to find out what happened to the Uruk-Hai, who were evidently late coming back, and this would also mean that when the orc says,
Our master grows impatient,
he is referring to Saruman, and they intend to travel back to Isengard together, all of which makes significantly more sense regardless of how exactly this played out in the source material. Because there is a ridiculous amount of behind-the-scenes content for these films, we can also ask Peter Jackson to make sense of this.
This whole concept is a little bit obscure for people that don't know Tolkien about the Uruk-Hai and the orcs having this rivalry. It's much clearer in the books. We sort of have obviously incorporated it into here because it's great, I think, to have these baddies having their own internal kind of arguments. There is a whole story in the book about where these orcs come from, and they're actually sent from Mordor, aren't they, in the books?
Which suggests that, in direct contrast to the books, Peter Jackson's intention was that these orcs came from Isengard, not Mordor. This is all a bit weird, given that every wiki page relating to The Lord of the Rings seems to indicate that these orcs came from Mordor, which, again, may have been the case in the books, but as portrayed in this extended scene and a later extended scene, straight up makes less sense than if they were from Isengard. Anyway, this quick dialogue exchange also helps to build tension, as it is made clear from the start of the film that the Uruk-Hai and the orcs do not like each other at all. Whereas in the theatrical edition, the bad guys are a relatively unified force, and they are simply taking the hobbits to their evil lair. This foreshadows the resultant conflict that the hobbits find themselves caught up in when the Uruk-Hai and the orcs come to blows over whether or not Merry and Pippin actually need their legs. The Uruks receive a lot of characterization in this scene. In both cuts of the Fellowship of the Ring, the Uruk-Hai don't have any dialogue, with the single exception of Lurtz, who is not particularly talkative. In the theatrical cut of The Two Towers, all we get from this scene is...
What is it? What do you smell? Man, flesh. I picked up our trail. Let's go!
Whilst this obviously depicts the Uruk-Hai as being able to think and speak, this dialogue, much like Lurtz's dialogue in The Fellowship of the Ring, is entirely utilitarian and practical. The Uruk-Hai of the theatrical editions do not discuss things, they do not really have personalities, they are very simple humanoid monster people who do what their masters tell them. They will communicate verbally, but only really to deliver simple information to each other. They are evil minions, and that is pretty much it. This extended scene, however, shows that the Uruks are not the borderline brainless automatons we see in the theatrical edition. They drink grog, which is an alcoholic beverage. They have an understanding of loyalty and a prioritization of orders, and they consider themselves to be physically and mentally superior to the orcs. They are also clearly very sadistic, given what they do to Merry, and this particular Uruk definitely has some distinct mannerisms that help give the Uruks as a whole a degree of personality.
Here, Kitty. Give him some medicine, boys. We will deliver them. God take his blood! Keep your mouth shut.
Meanwhile, Merry is seemingly unconscious, which causes Pippin to become worried. He begs the Uruks to help Merry, which prompts them to force-feed Merry some grog. Merry then reveals to Pippin that he isn't actually hurt, and that it was just an act, although he doesn't appear to be as okay as he claims.
You're hurt? I'm fine. It was just an act.
Merry has a large gash in his forehead, and has been dangling from the back of an Uruk running virtually non-stop for 3 days and nights, presumably being given no food or water. Merry is absolutely not doing fine. He is just pretending that he is okay, so as to stop Pippin from worrying about him, which means that Pippin's naivety actually causes further harm to Merry, as Pippin appeared to expect, or perhaps hope, that the Uruks would help him. The Uruks were ordered to bring the halflings back to Saruman alive and unspoiled, but Pippin of course would not know this, and it is confirmed later that at this point he has no idea where he is going or why, and so his pleading with the Uruks to give Merry some water further builds on his prior characterization. He is naive, and other people suffer as a result of this. Yes, oftentimes Pippin's antics are facilitated or even encouraged by Merry, but Pippin is usually the instigator. When they steal one of Gandalf's fireworks, Pippin lights it, believing the pole to already be embedded in the ground. Pippin then inadvertently leads the hobbits to the edge of Farmer Maggot's field, seemingly unaware that it was a cliff, despite having stolen from the field multiple times before. After Merry returns from the bar with a full pint of beer, Pippin decides to do the same and carelessly reveals Frodo's name to some strangers. When the hobbits start cooking sausages, tomatoes, and nice crispy bacon, this is absolutely a case of Sam, Merry, and Pippin all being very careless. However, this would likely have been proposed by Pippin, given that he seems to be the most food-oriented. And, most notably, Pippin's curiosity causes him to accidentally alert the goblins to the Fellowship's presence in Moria, which, if we draw out the chain of cause and effect, ultimately causes Gandalf's death, as had they remained hidden from the goblins, the Balrog may not have awoken. Point being, although Merry and Pippin absolutely start out as the bumbling jokesters of the Fellowship, it is Pippin specifically who causes problems due to his simple, laid-back, and carefree personality. And, in spite of all of this, Merry still looks out for him even when Merry himself is injured, as seen in this extended scene, which maintains the level of dependence Pippin has on Merry, which then helps make the moment when they are separated in The Return of the King work as well as it does on an emotional level. We then tie back in with the theatrical edition, with the Uruks smelling Aragorn's flesh, and they continue taking the hobbits to Isengard. Overall, this scene is excellent. However, it is unfortunately placed at the start of The Two Towers, and getting the audience locked back in with the characters of Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli as quickly as possible will have been a priority. Nothing in this extended scene is vital, and the main things that are lost with its removal are the early introduction of the orcs, plus some characterization for the hobbits, neither of which I think are worth the trade-off in terms of the pacing of the opening 15 minutes of the Two Towers. In terms of the quality of this scene, I would give it an A. However, the scene as implemented in the film I can't give higher than a B, because of the clear advantages to removing it, which is pretty much exactly how I feel about the concerning Hobbit scene from the Fellowship of the Ring. After a brief montage of more Uruk-Hai being birthed and weapons and armor being forged, we get our next extended change in the Burning of the Westfold sequence. This brief conversation between Saruman and an orc does foreshadow a couple of plot points that will become important later in the film. However, 2 of these 3 plot points are not plot points that needed to be explained to be understood. Saruman tells the orc that he wants the Uruk-Hai armed and ready within 2 weeks, but the orc tells him that there are too many Uruks and that they can't be armed in time. This suggests that Saruman is working his baby factories on overdrive and is pumping out quite a few soldiers, which of course become the primary threat of the Two Towers. Later in the film, when Wormtongue finally sees the true scale of Saruman's army, he sheds a tear. However, this moment works perfectly fine without including this extra line about Saruman pumping out a load of Uruks, as the audience already knew by this point that Saruman was building an army. Saruman then tells the orc,
"Build a dam, block the stream, work the furnaces night and day,"
which establishes the existence of a dam, and this dam being breached is eventually what destroys his facilities at Isengard. Again, we do not explicitly need an explanation as to why there is a dam for this payoff to function, but again, it is nice to have, as it suggests that Saruman's reach exceeded his grasp, and by building a dam to allow him to accelerate his production of armor and weaponry, he inadvertently created something of an Achilles heel that would be exploited by the Ents later in the film. And finally, Saruman tells the orc to start flaming the forest of Fangorn to feed the fires.
"The forest of Fangorn lies on our doorstep. Burn it."
This scene establishes the whole concept of Fangorn being the forest on the borders of Isengard, and Fangorn is what they're now going to rip into to get more wood and timber to burn in the industry, and ultimately, obviously, Fangorn, the forest, exacts its revenge.
This particular scene is not in the theatrical version, probably because, to the best of my recollection, you don't see the orcs going out and burning down part of the forest. He has this hatred for nature, which again is never entirely explained, but at some point he obviously decides that everything has to go.
This one, I think, does definitely benefit the film as a whole, although this line on its own is not quite justification enough to include this entire extended scene. This dialogue exchange and the prior sequence showing the expansion of the war machine of Isengard shows us how much Saruman is willing to destroy in order to achieve his goal. His comments about building a dam are very brief and are not focused on, whereas his order to burn the forest of Fangorn is treated as a dramatic climax. It is the focal point of the scene. Saruman is crossing a line by ordering the destruction of the forest, as until now he had been exclusively or primarily shitting on his own floor, so to speak. He had devastated the beauty of Isengard, and his rapid-fire production of an army intended to destroy Rohan has now necessitated that he begin desecrating his surroundings as well. This feeds into the scene towards the end of the film, where Pippin tricks Treebeard into realizing what Saruman has done, which is an important character moment for both Pippin and Treebeard. By including this scene as further setup, explicitly stating that Saruman is expanding his devastation of nature so as to enable his destruction of Rohan, it gives the audience further context for what exactly Saruman is doing, and why. Whereas in the theatrical edition, we only know that Saruman is evil and is destroying things, and at the end we find out that Fangorn Forest was one of those things. We then get a very short change that leads into Saruman rousing the wild men of Dunland to burninate the countryside. Inside Orthanc, a wild man swears his allegiance to Saruman, saying that they will fight and die for him. This change is only 20 seconds in length, and I guess it is nice to have, but it doesn't provide any additional information to the audience that isn't also conveyed in the subsequent scene, which makes very clear that the wild men of Dunland will fight and die for Saruman, without having the wild men of Dunland say that they will fight and die for Saruman. Overall, this extended scene is solid. However, aside from the extra bit of setup involving the dam and the burning of Fangorn, there isn't any particular need for it to exist in the film. By cutting straight to Saruman telling the wild men, "Get out there and fuck shit up," rather than showing us a conversation regarding the logistics of arming such a large army, followed by a wild man swearing allegiance to Saruman, the theatrical edition excellently maintains its pace leading into the primary conflict of the film. We cut from Legolas and Aragorn realizing that the hobbits are being taken to Saruman telling Sauron via the Palantir how he intends to remove those who oppose them, to him ordering the wild men to culturally enrich the Westfold, a sequence that then leads us directly into Rohan, a bunch of new characters, and the main conflict of the second act of The Lord of the Rings. All of this is extremely deliberate, focused, and purposeful, and although the extended changes to the burning of the Westfold scene are good, removing them does definitely improve the pacing of this opening stretch of the Two Towers. Therefore, I am going to place the burning of the Westfold extended scene in B, because although I think the content is useful, it doesn't quite do enough to justify the runtime, and there is definitely an argument for removing it. After the burning of the Westfold, we get a new scene, Massacre at the Fords of Isen. The theatrical edition cuts immediately to Eomer carrying an injured Theodred back to Edoras, and we don't learn who these characters are until later. In the extended edition, however, we see the aftermath of the battle that ends up claiming Theodred's life. We see the bodies of many soldiers and horses, which further shows the consequences of Saruman's betrayal.
The shadow of Saruman looms over everything that is happening throughout the entire film. This dark menace, this awful cloud. He's an invisible presence on occasions, but just the same, immensely powerful.
This scene coming immediately after the burning of the Westfold is very effective, because it shows that Saruman isn't simply ploughing his way through a bunch of undefended peasants, but he is also wiping out entire battalions of mounted soldiers. This helps to build tension by showing, rather than suggesting, that the forces of Rohan are not prepared to deal with Saruman's betrayal. The extended edition then draws a clear distinction between the forces of Isengard and Mordor.
Mordor will pay for this. These orcs are not from Mordor.
Whereas in the theatrical edition, the antagonists are depicted as a more unified evil.
It's political intrigue that's in the book, and it's a bit hard to translate it into the movie. The white hand on the helmet is the first clue that Saruman is behind this. It's kind of intrigue and mystery in a way that can easily overcomplicate what is already a complicated story.
And shortly afterwards, Eomer finds Theodred, realizes he is still alive, and carries him back to Edoras, where we tie back in with the theatrical edition. This scene gives context to Theodred's death, which isn't particularly important to the story of The Lord of the Rings, but it also provides a very small but important tweak to Eomer's character. In the extended edition, there was clearly a battle. Theodred was injured, and Eomer then went to find Theodred of his own accord, presumably after Theodred and his men did not return. In the theatrical edition, however, we don't have any of this context. We only have Eomer's line,
He was ambushed by orcs.
And the presumption then is that Eomer, his men, and Theodred were ambushed, and they then fled after Theodred was injured. This is a very small but important change to Eomer's character, as the theatrical edition implies that he failed to protect Theodred, whereas the extended edition instead implies that he put himself at risk to rescue Theodred. Overall, I quite like this scene. It adds a bit of clarity to what exactly happened to Theodred and why. In the theatrical edition, we know that Saruman is attacking Rohan, and we then cut to Eomer carrying an injured Theodred, and so we can obviously connect the dots here without explicitly seeing Eomer rescuing Theodred, which is almost certainly why this scene was cut. But this extended scene does give Eomer some agency and also serves as the first building block for his hatred of Saruman, as we get to see the broader consequences for Saruman's actions beyond the fact that one guy was wounded off-screen and died as a result. I am therefore going to place the Massacre at the Fords of Isen in B. Next up, we get a very slight adjustment to the Banishment of Eomer. In the theatrical edition, Eomer reveals that the orcs who attacked Theodred bore the white hand of Saruman. Eomer then suggests that Wormtongue is working with Saruman. It is heavily implied that Wormtongue was promised Eowyn as a reward for his services, and Wormtongue then banishes Eomer as a result of his knowledge of Saruman's involvement.
You see much, Eomer, son of Eomer. Too much.
The extended edition adds a bit more to this exchange.
You are banished forthwith from the kingdom of Rohan, all its domains.
This is another one of those minuscule changes that doesn't particularly matter either way, as all it does is specify that Rohan has many domains and Eomer is banished from all of them. Congratulations, Peter Jackson, you saved yourself, 2 seconds. Every little helps though. Anyway, Eomer then responds that Wormtongue has no such authority to banish him, and Wormtongue then presents a signed document from Theoden. By explicitly showing that Theoden has decreed that his own nephew be banished, it shows how badly Theoden has been corrupted. In the theatrical edition, the suggestion is that Wormtongue orders Eomer's banishment because Wormtongue is kind of in charge and the guards listen to him because the king's brain is currently on dial-up, but the extended edition clarifies that Theoden himself gave the order, and he would of course have been manipulated into doing this by Wormtongue. The outcome is the same, but only in the extended edition do we get the added context that Theoden is directly acting against his own interests, rather than simply sitting back and letting Wormtongue run Edoras into the ground. Additionally, the fact that Theoden supposedly signed this document that morning
He signed it this morning.
strongly suggests that Wormtongue planned to have Eomer banished regardless of his knowledge of Saruman's involvement, and he merely used the fact that Eomer had discovered the White Hand as an excuse, which then implies that Eomer has been getting in the way both of Saruman's subversion of Theoden, but also of Wormtongue's own lust for Éowyn. These changes add up to less than 20 seconds, and they don't particularly impact the pacing of the film. However, they do help to further establish Wormtongue as a scheming shitbag who exploits the power he has to defeat people far stronger than him. It also adds a bit more depth to Saruman's corruption of Theoden, which helps to contrast him with his behavior after he is purified by Gandalf. I like this change a lot, because it adds character for Wormtongue, deepens Saruman's control over Theoden, and implies a history of Éomer getting in Wormtongue's way. All of this strictly benefits the film, whilst only prolonging the scene by about 15 seconds, and so I am going to place this scene in A. The night camp at Fangorn scene is slightly longer in the extended edition. After one of the orcs tries to eat Merry and Pippin's legs, and Uruk pushes him back.
Get back, scum!
In the theatrical edition, we cut straight to another orc swinging his sword at the hobbits, at which point he is beheaded by the Uruks, and meat is back on the menu. In the extended edition, we get further dialogue after the initial confrontation.
The prisoners go to Saruman, alive and unspoiled.
This is a reiteration of the line from the earlier extended scene,
Saruman will have his prize.
and thereby further cements Saruman's Uruk-Hai as both formidable and thoroughly devoted to him. This contrasts them with the more animalistic orcs, who seem less worried about following orders, and are evidently willing to bend the rules if they haven't eaten meat in a few days. Another orc then asks why the hobbits need to be delivered alive, suggesting that the orcs were given no such orders. The Uruk then replies that the hobbits have an elvish weapon, and that Saruman wants it for the war. The explanation for this line took a bit of digging, and this is another reason why I am convinced that these orcs are not working directly for Sauron, or to be more specific, they are not only working for Sauron. These orcs must have come from Isengard, and they serve Sauron by way of serving Saruman. If these orcs are from Mordor, and are only interested in what Sauron wants, then it makes very little sense for the Uruk-Hai to explain to them that the hobbits are carrying a weapon, because this would mean that the Uruk-Hai, who have until this point been depicted as entirely devoted to Saruman, have decided to tell the orcs who serve a different master, that the hobbits are carrying some kind of important weapon. However, if these orcs are from Isengard, which, despite contradicting the source material, was all but confirmed by Peter Jackson to be the case and makes vastly more sense, then instead of depicting the Uruk-Hai as being morons, this scene depicts them as very intelligent and capable of deception and manipulation. So, if both the orcs and the Uruks are from Isengard, why would the Uruks tell the orcs that Saruman wants the hobbits alive because they are carrying an elvish weapon? If we wind back to the Fellowship of the Ring, we know that Lurtz was told,
one of the halflings
orcs carries something of great value.
The Uruks therefore did not know that they were there to retrieve the One Ring, nor did they believe it to be an elvish weapon. They were told to bring the halflings back alive and unspoiled, and that one of them was carrying something extremely valuable, and so that is precisely what these Uruk-Hai intend to do. Now that they have been joined by a group of orcs who received no such orders, there is a conflict as to what to do with the hobbits, and whether or not to prioritize their legs over the fact that they haven't eaten meat in 3 days. The Uruk leader tells the orcs that they were ordered by Saruman to deliver the hobbits alive, but this doesn't work because the orcs are hungry and are evidently more used to eating their prisoners than protecting them. In a further attempt to defuse the orc munchies, the Uruk leader then tells the orcs that the hobbits are carrying an elvish weapon. 2 important things to note here are that the One Ring is not an elvish weapon, and even if it were, the Uruk-Hai were not told that they were recovering the One Ring. This means that the Uruk leader is lying to the orcs so as to get them back in line and dissuade them from harming the hobbits. The reason why he specifies elvish weapon is likely because orcs and Uruks cannot wield elvish weapons, and so the hobbits need to be alive in order for the Uruk-Hai to complete their mission. If the orcs kill the hobbits, it will not be possible to retrieve the weapon, meaning that the Uruk-Hai will fail and this would not be acceptable to them. This is excellent in characterizing the Uruk-Hai, although it does lean slightly harder on book knowledge than I would like, which is a little counterintuitive given that in the books these orcs are definitively from Mordor. We have very limited references for the idea that orcs can't wield elvish weapons in the Peter Jackson films. The best references are rather tangential. The Elven Rope causes Gollum physical pain when around his neck, and in a later extended scene Gollum is shown to be incapable of eating elven bread, and so it is quite likely that, even if we do wholly restrict our understanding of Middle-earth to the Peter Jackson films, similarly evil and corrupted creatures would also experience pain, or at the very least discomfort, wielding any kind of elvish weapon. We do also have the scene from An Unexpected Journey, where the goblins freak out when they see Orcrist and Glamdring, but I have spent enough time talking about those fucking movies, so for my own sanity, I will continue. Pippin realizes that their captors believe they have the ring, and Merry quickly hushes him, stating that if the orcs or the Uruks realize that they do not have the ring, the hobbits will be killed. This is entirely in character for both of them, and it appears to inform their decision to sneak off immediately once meat is back on the menu, but as they would obviously seize any opportunity to escape, regardless of the specific reason as to why they have been captured, this isn't entirely necessary. And finally, we have a quick shot of the orc's decapitated body, which I assume was censored as it was deemed to be too explicit. These changes function primarily to amplify the threat of the Uruk-Hai, which is very effective. They are shown throughout the film to be extremely intimidating and physically proficient, but this scene also shows them to be very capable of critical thinking, manipulation, and deception, all of which are qualities usually associated with antagonists who are not physically threatening. Examples of these kinds of antagonists include Silco from Arcane, Scar from The Lion King, Tarkin from Star Wars, Moriarty from Sherlock, Wormtongue, and of course, Yzma. These are very different antagonists to the ones who primarily, or only, function as a physical threat to the protagonists, which would include most movie monsters such as the Alien, the Predator, Godzilla, the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, Michael Myers, plus the absolute Chad specimen himself, Kronk. There are moments where, for example, the Alien Queen and the Velociraptors are shown to be more intelligent than simple monsters, and these moments are often when the creatures are at their most threatening. This is the exact same reason why Smaug is particularly effective in the Hobbit movies, provided we cut out the cartoon chase sequence, because he is incredibly physically imposing, but also highly intelligent and articulate. This is also accomplished, to a lesser degree, in this extended scene with the Uruk-Hai, as it helps to establish them as a more significant threat than if they were just brain-dead roid bros. Anyway, this scene also informs Merry and Pippin that their captors believe that they have the ring, which gives us a nice character moment where they both acknowledge their dilemma, but again, this is not entirely necessary, as the audience already knows why they have been captured by the Uruk-Hai. I am going to place these changes in B, as the scene itself I think is better overall in the extended edition due to how it depicts the Uruk-Hai. However, trimming this conflict does focus the scene more specifically on Merry and Pippin's escape, which is far more important narratively than showing us how smart the Uruk-Hai are. The Passage of the Marshes sequence is significantly longer in the extended edition, and it very effectively builds tension between Frodo, Sam, and Gollum, as Sam is excellently contrasted with Gollum in his complaints about where they are, and Gollum then attempts to suck up to Frodo for the first time.
I hate this place. It's too quiet. Hasn't been sight nor sound of a bird for 2 days.
Gollum also laments the lack of birds, because he can't eat them. This draws a very simple but very effective distinction between Sam and Gollum, as Sam likes birds because they signify natural beauty, comfort, and homeliness, whereas Gollum likes birds because they are crunchable. Gollum then catches a worm and eats it, which puts Sam off his own food, despite Gollum considering this to be totally normal behavior. These are both amusing comedic beats, but they are more than simply jokes intended to make the audience laugh. The primary purpose is storytelling, specifically to emphasize and foster Sam's dislike of Gollum, and to contrast his reaction with Frodo's. Where Sam is disgusted by Gollum's behavior, Frodo offers Gollum a piece of lembas bread, showing pity and sympathy for Gollum, which is informed by his discussion with Gandalf in the Fellowship of the Ring. Gollum excitedly eats the lembas bread, not knowing what it is, but then gags and spits it out.
We can't eat horrid food!
This is probably not entirely accurate, but is prompted by Gollum not knowing that the lembas bread is actually elvish bread, which then explains why he has such a negative reaction to it, as well as the elvish rope. Gollum is a corrupted entity, and elves are the oldest and wisest race in Middle-earth whose nature is complex, but even if just taking the films as reference, can absolutely be described as a supernatural good, hence Gollum being unable to eat elvish food. The alternative explanation is that the process of cooking fish or rabbits somehow makes Gollum unable to eat them, which makes slightly less sense. This also comes up again in The Return of the King, as the fact that Gollum cannot eat lembas bread is very important, and showing both the audience and Frodo that Gollum will start violently retching and gagging if he tries to eat it functions as a setup to this moment that is absent in the theatrical edition. Gollum then concludes that he must starve, as the dead Marshes and Emin Muil are tragically bereft of crunchable birdses and rabbitses. But Sam doesn't appear to care about the fact that Gollum is hungry, believing that Frodo should not have trusted Gollum in the first place.
Well, starve then. Good riddance.
We then get our first instance of Gollum sucking up to Frodo.
He does not care if we be hungry, not like master.
Gollum tries to establish a connection with Frodo, as both of them know what it is like to carry the One Ring, when Sam does not. This is not simply a case of Gollum being manipulative and intentionally trying to drive a wedge between Sam and Frodo, although this, of course, comes into play later on. This scene is more a case of Gollum noticing and appreciating the fact that Frodo is showing him pity.
This is one of the extra scenes that we wrote originally to begin a sort of a slightly more meaningful relationship between Gollum and Frodo.
It's playing to the first beat where you see that there is this connection between them, and that comes, of course, at the end of the scene.
It is not at all impossible that the ring is heavily influencing his behaviour, and is therefore driving him towards befriending Frodo so as to later betray him and take the ring for himself.
Once it takes hold of us, it never lets go.
This directly plays into the tragedy of Gollum and portrays him as a highly sympathetic character.
Probably the most important function of the scene is to start to mirror that Gollum has shared knowledge with Frodo about what it's like to carry this ring, information that Sam can never ever know.
However, Frodo pushes Gollum away, not wanting him anywhere near the ring. This is a small moment between Frodo and Gollum that plays into what ends up happening in the very next scene, where Gollum rescues Frodo after he falls into the marshes. In the theatrical edition, it is a surprise to both Frodo and the audience that Gollum, and not Sam, rescued him.
But also that scene was meant to play very directly to when Frodo rejects Gollum and finds him disgusting. And this is meant to be part of his journey towards actually seeing something else. But at this start, at the very beginning, he finds Gollum disgusting. And it was supposed to play to this moment where he turns the other way and Gollum almost, even though he saves Frodo, rejects him and is quite cold to him when he pulls him out and just says, "Don't follow the lights."
This, however, is not directly contrasted with anything, although the moment works well enough in isolation in the theatrical edition. In the extended edition, Frodo's shock at Gollum saving his life is excellently contrasted with him shouting at Gollum and saying, "Don't touch me," moments earlier. Frodo did not treat Gollum as well as he perhaps should have, and in spite of this, Gollum endangers himself to rescue Frodo from the Marshes. Additionally, the line about the ring never letting go once it has taken hold further informs Gollum's actions. He did not just save Frodo, he also saved his precious. This line also makes Frodo very uncomfortable and foreshadows the fact that throughout the course of the trilogy, Frodo will lose his psychological battle against the corruption of the ring. Overall, this extended scene is excellent both in content and placement within the film. It builds upon the tragedy of Gollum and the ring's highly addictive and corrupting nature. It expands upon Sam's dislike of Gollum and gives Frodo more of a back and forth with Gollum before the Smeagol discussion. The passage of the Marshes extended scene is not absolutely necessary, but it has enough character work in it for me to confidently place it in A. Next up is the White Rider scene, where we get two very minor changes followed by a rather large one. The first change comes as Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli enter Fangorn, and Aragorn tells Gimli to lower his axe as he is pissing off the trees. Legolas continues that the elves woke up the trees and taught them to speak. Gimli's response is,
Talking trees. What do trees have to talk about, except the consistency of squirrel droppings?
This is another comedic moment that was removed from the theatrical edition, possibly to reduce the audience's perception of Gimli as a comic relief character. However, it also provides a tiny amount of world building and backstory by establishing where these semi-sentient trees, referred to in the books as Huorns, came from.
The lore of the forest that Tolkien wrote, you get confused with what treebeard actually is. People obviously think he's a tree. But Ents are not trees. They're sort of like humanoid creatures who obviously look like trees, but they are shepherds of the forest, and the forest is a whole other form of life. The natural trees, which are actually very dangerous, they're called the Huorns, which we never really use in the film. And the Ents are there to look after the trees and make sure the trees don't get any mischief or they don't, have any harm done to them. They're actually there as protectors of the trees, and they're two very different species.
The extended edition goes on to draw a very clear distinction between the Ents and the Huorns, despite never actually naming them as such, whereas in the theatrical edition, the Huorns are only very vaguely referenced a single time.
Anger festers in their hearts. They will harm you if they can.
And the impression is very much that Fangorn itself is a pretty normal forest, but some of the trees are actually Ents, which is the reason the forest is known to be particularly dangerous. This piece of world building is not critical to understanding the events of the film, but Gimli's joke works well enough, and it is definitely appropriate for Gimli to be very skeptical of Legolas's description of talking trees. The second change comes after Gandalf reveals himself, and Legolas apologizes for confusing Gandalf with Saruman. Legolas is the reason why the three attacked Gandalf, as he mistakenly identified Gandalf as Saruman. And given that Legolas is broadly characterized as someone who doesn't really make mistakes, and on the rare occasion that he does slip up, he will apologize, it makes sense that he would ask Gandalf to forgive him. Gandalf then replies,
I am Saruman. Rather Saruman as he should have been.
This is a minor clarification that hints at the wider mythology of Tolkien's Middle-earth that the films were largely unable to include.
There's one tiny line here that I put back in the DVD that we took out of the theatrical cut because it was too obscure, but when he says, I am Saruman, at least Saruman as he should have been, which I kind of understand it, but I love the poetry of it. And we thought it was a bit obscure for the theatrical movie, but I put it back in here because I like it.
In the theatrical edition, the explanation for Gandalf's return is that he was sent back to complete his task, and the audience is left to infer the rest. We can assume that there is a higher power orchestrating Gandalf's return, the one who sent him back, but the film does not elaborate and leaves this wide open to interpretation. In the extended edition, we get this additional line, suggesting that Gandalf has returned as Gandalf the White as a direct result of Saruman the White's recent betrayal, and that his return is a balancing of the scale and a righting of the wrong of Saruman. This is a condensation of how this plays out in the source material, albeit not explicitly, where Eru Ilúvatar, who may as well be God, resurrected Gandalf for the reason I laid out above. There was presumably some kind of intended cosmic plan to defeat Sauron, but Saruman's betrayal caused everything to go tits up, and so Eru Ilúvatar righted the wrong of Gandalf's demise and set him on the path originally intended for Saruman. A lot of this information is not necessary for the film, and it doesn't even explicitly appear in the book either, only ever being implied. Suddenly name-dropping Eru Iluvatar 4 hours into the trilogy would have been a colossal mistake, as it would have then required that the writers explain who and what Eru Iluvatar is, which, even if possible, would have taken up a chunk of valuable screen time, although I do think that the specific reference to Gandalf the White as being Saruman the White as he should have been is more than enough to serve as an explanation for his return, and is a far better solution than just kind of avoiding the question as in the theatrical edition, where the explanation is a little too mysterious. After Gandalf tells them that they must ride urgently to Edoras, the theatrical edition cuts directly to him summoning Shadowfax and them riding to Edoras. The extended edition instead gives us some dialogue between the 4 characters, some more comic relief courtesy of Gimli, and clarifies a couple of points that are left irritatingly vague in the theatrical edition. First off, Gandalf and Aragorn discuss Rohan.
We hear of trouble in Rohan. It goes ill with the king.
Yes, and it will not be easily cured.
Upon hearing that they are heading to Edoras, Gimli then suggests that he doesn't want to abandon Merry and Pippin in a spooky forest, which is another small but important detail that is entirely absent in the theatrical edition. Fangorn Forest is set up to be a very dangerous place.
Fangorn, what madness drove me there?
In the theatrical edition, Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli have been tracking Merry and Pippin for days, only to be told by Gandalf, "Let's go to Edoras," and they then abandon their mission without a second thought. We do, of course, know that Treebeard brought Merry and Pippin to Gandalf, and we can therefore assume that in the theatrical edition, Gandalf made sure the hobbits were safe, but as this information is never directly communicated to Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli, it appears as though they abandoned their mission without any kind of protest, when rescuing the hobbits had been their sole objective for the last few days. Then we get some more comic relief from Gimli.
Are we to leave those poor hobbits here in this horrid, dark, dank, tree-infested... I mean, charming. Quite charming. Forest.
And I am in 2 minds about this joke. On the one hand, this is quite exaggerated and silly, but on the other, the comedy is drawn entirely from Gimli's lack of understanding as to what is going on. From his perspective, he pissed off a load of trees, having only learned minutes earlier that supposedly some trees are special and can talk, and with the foreknowledge that Fangorn Forest is a dangerous place to be. In an amusing attempt to rectify this, he reassures the forest that it is quite charming, when Fangorn Forest is obviously not what you would call a charming place. Some of Gimli's comedy in the extended editions does lean slightly too hard on being silly, particularly in The Return of the King, but this joke I don't consider to be too out of place given Gimli's characterization. Gandalf then continues that Merry and Pippin will be like the falling of small stones that start an avalanche, and that they will awaken a great power sleeping in Fangorn. This hints at Gandalf having some kind of master plan, but more importantly, clarifies to both the audience and to Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli that they don't need to worry about Merry and Pippin. There is also a very brief moment of levity in the form of character bonding between Aragorn and Gandalf, which is much appreciated.
In one thing you have not changed, dear friend. You still speak in riddles.
One potential downside to including this scene, however, is that Gandalf explicitly states that
The Ents are going to wake up and find that they are strong.
Which you could say neuters the tension of the later Ent scenes, as Gandalf apparently knows that they are going to help. However, as happened with Saruman, Gandalf's plans are not set in stone. Neither are the plans of whatever unnamed god being resurrected Gandalf. The fact that Gandalf believes that the Ents are going to wake up and find that they are strong does not necessarily mean that it is going to be anywhere near as simple as that. Anyway, right before we tie back in with the theatrical edition, we get one more comedic moment from Gimli.
This new Gandalf's more grumpy than the old one.
Which, again, I take no issue with, as Gimli is not reduced to being a clown person for the sake of comedy. He is responding in an appropriately confused and amusingly exasperated manner, and the comedy is drawn from the idea that he has no comprehension of what the actual differences between the old and new Gandalf are.
I love the fact that Gimli has really... I mean, he's a much stronger character in this movie. And
yeah,
credit to John Rhys Davies and to the writing as well, because they picked out some really great comedy moments in this film.
Well, I think he strikes
really
the exact right
tone between comic relief without compromising the kind of inherent dramatic tension that if you relinquish it, you might not get it back.
Yep.
This is very funny because Gimli has just seen Gandalf come back to life, something that straight up does not happen in Middle-earth, which means Gimli has just witnessed a miracle, and because of his extremely limited understanding of what just happened, his observation is that the new Gandalf is grumpy. These changes clarify parts of the story that were perhaps a little too vague in the theatrical edition. The reason for Gandalf's resurrection is clearer, as is Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli leaving Merry and Pippin in Fangorn Forest. 2 of the 3 Gimli jokes are fine, 1 is excellent, and there is plenty of juicy character work for all 4 protagonists, which means this scene solidly earns its place in A. This next scene in Fangorn Forest plays out differently in each cut of the film. In the theatrical edition, Treebeard tells the hobbits that his home lies deep in the forest, and that he will keep them safe, as he promised Gandalf. He then continues,
Trees have grown wild and dangerous. Anger festers in their hearts. They will harm you if they can.
And tells the hobbits that there are too few Ents left to manage them. This helps to maintain a sense of danger within Fangorn Forest, although this is the only reference in the theatrical edition to the trees actually being sentient beings in and of themselves, which is depicted slightly differently in the extended edition. In the extended edition, Treebeard recites a poem, and Merry yawns as he is either bored or tired, or more likely a combination of both, given that he asks Treebeard how much further they are going to travel. Treebeard tells the hobbits where they are going, and that he will keep them safe, as he does in the theatrical edition. He then says,
I believe you will enjoy this next one too. It's one of my own compositions.
And he begins reciting another poem, causing the hobbits to fall asleep. As with all things Ent related, this scene takes its time. There is 27 seconds of landscape footage as Treebeard recites his poem, which is almost double the length of the Wormtongue banishing Eomer change. As I have already explained, there are a fair few things we can draw out of that change, which is not the case with this extended Song of the Entwives scene. Whilst this landscape footage is lovely, this does not advance the story. This is in stark contrast to, for example, the Lighting the Beacons sequence from The Return of the King, which also primarily features some very nice-looking landscape footage, but the Lighting the Beacons sequence is incredibly important to the story of The Lord of the Rings, and also conveys the passage of time and distance, which is, again, not the case with the Song of the Entwives scene. If the Lighting the Beacons sequence was not plot relevant, and if it was instead an unrelated story Gandalf was telling Pippin about that one time when someone lit some beacons, then the context of the scene itself would drastically change, and it would go from being incredibly important to incredibly unimportant. Speaking of, the content of Treebeard's poems is irrelevant to what is happening at this point in the story. Both of his poems relate to the Entwives and how he misses them, which does not impact any part of the plot of The Lord of the Rings, and all it accomplishes is that it gives the Ents a little more backstory. However, as this backstory does not actually affect their motivations or their actions, this scene is absolutely one that I support Peter Jackson's decision to remove for the theatrical release. These poems could be the best poems that had ever been written, and they would still negatively affect the film due to their irrelevance and their length. Anyway, after realizing that the hobbits are asleep, Treebeard places them down on the forest floor, makes like a tree, and leaves, saying that he has business in the forest.
There are many to call, many that must come.
This seems rather irresponsible, given that he promised Gandalf that he would keep them safe, and given that the hobbits were just sound asleep on Treebeard, and so he could have simply taken them with him. His leaving the hobbits in the forest alone makes very little sense. Treebeard is Peter Jackson's favourite character in The Lord of the Rings, which perhaps explains some of his decision-making when cutting together the extended edition. In total, this scene is 2 minutes and 21 seconds long, 1 minute and 8 seconds of which is entirely dedicated to Treebeard reciting poems.
It was the one thing that I wished we could have hung on to, actually, is Treebeard's poetry, because it kind of gives the character an unexpected, humorous slant, which I think the theatrical would have probably benefited from it a bit. But it was slow, and it was something that, when we were dealing with a film that we had to get down to 3 hours, was just something we decided that we could do without. A lot of people have criticised Treebeard for being a bit slow. You know how a lot of reviews said that Treebeard was kind of slow and boring. And what this scene does is it sort of celebrates the fact he's slow and boring, and it makes a humorous point of it, which I think actually the film would have benefited from that, because then you would have got it. You would have thought, oh, okay, all right, this guy is slow and boring, and accepted it more.
This kind of thing absolutely damages the pace of the film, as we are spending valuable time doing not much. There is a small amount of characterization in this scene, but the majority of it boils down to Treebeard talking extremely slowly about things that do not advance either the story or the characters of the two towers. The content of the scene is mostly fine in terms of what it accomplishes for Treebeard, but as a scene in a movie that is 3.5 hours long, it does not justify itself anywhere near well enough. The theatrical version of this scene is much better in terms of pacing, and it is far more deliberate in its purpose, and so I am going to place the extended Song of the Entwives scene in D. Next up is a brand new scene that is packed with important details, the Heir of Numenor. Like the previous extended scene, this one almost entirely consists of one character talking. But unlike the previous extended scene, this one contains very important information relating to both plot and character, but is also not entirely expository in nature. This scene primarily exists to establish what the protagonist's objectives are for the rest of the film before they arrive at Edoras, and to clarify the broader state of Middle-earth involving Sauron, Saruman, Aragorn, and Frodo. So, Gandalf, Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli have set up camp whilst travelling to Edoras, and Gandalf delivers a monologue to Aragorn. He tells him that Sauron will suffer no rival, hinting that Saruman's true objective is to recover the ring for himself and overthrow Sauron as the Dark Lord of Middle-earth, a concept that is not present in the theatrical edition.
I don't think that Saruman quite realizes that Sauron is always one step ahead. Well, I think he thinks he is. And he, of course, pretends to be the servant of Sauron as part of the deception. Sauron quite obviously sees through this. After all, he's got a big enough eye to do so.
This also reminds the audience that although the immediate threat and primary antagonist of the two towers is Saruman, it is Sauron who must ultimately be defeated. Gandalf then continues,
"But he is not so mighty yet that he is above fear. The rumor has reached him. The Heir of Numenor still lives. Sauron fears you, Aragorn. He fears what you may become."
There are a couple of possibilities here. A question that can be asked is, how does Gandalf know what Sauron does and does not know? And this question can only really be rather unsatisfyingly answered by saying, he's a wizard. An alternative read of this scene, however, is that Gandalf doesn't necessarily know with certainty that Sauron is aware of who Aragorn is, but Gandalf absolutely wants to ensure that Aragorn fulfills his destiny. Gandalf doesn't necessarily know exactly what went down with Boromir in the Fellowship of the Ring, and he doesn't even necessarily know what Aragorn thinks about the prospect of becoming king, because this is not a discussion they have had on screen. Regardless, telling Aragorn that Sauron is afraid of him is absolutely going to boost Aragorn's confidence in taking on a leadership role, which Gandalf considers vital in ultimately defeating Sauron.
This scene serves a purpose in the sense that it does focus Gandalf as the enemy of Sauron, and that he's very much reliant upon Aragorn to be his ally, and the fact that he's saying to Aragorn, well, you know, Sauron now knows about you, and he's basically going to be coming after you too.
Gandalf then continues that Sauron will use Saruman to destroy Rohan, and he explains that Theoden's mind is enslaved by Saruman. This isn't entirely necessary, as we already know this, and so does Aragorn.
Saruman has poisoned the mind of the king and claimed lordship over these lands.
However, this feeds directly into some excellent storytelling that is completely absent in the theatrical edition. Gandalf and Aragorn discuss Frodo and the ring.
For all their cunning, we have one advantage. The ring remains hidden, and that we should seek to destroy it has not yet entered their darkest dreams.
I think that these moments actually help to make the movie a more complete story. It includes elements of the books that were left out for the theatrical release that I completely understand why they weren't included in the theatrical, but as a fan of the books, and just as a fan of film in general, it helps to make a more complete full-bodied story.
In the theatrical editions, Aragorn does not acknowledge or discuss Frodo or the ring after their scene together at Amon Hen until 14 minutes into the Return of the King.
No news of Frodo.
By including this line in The Two Towers, however, it clearly shows that Frodo is still at the forefront of their minds. The Fellowship may have been broken, but that doesn't mean they have failed. A lot has happened since they parted ways, and in the theatrical edition, it could easily come off as though Aragorn and Gandalf have been caught up in side quests, whilst ignoring the fact that Frodo is doing the main quest. This line in the extended edition instead ensures that both of them are very aware of the fact that none of what they are doing will matter in the slightest if Frodo fails.
It was quite a challenge to try and link those stories because they're not particularly linked in the books, and they are told in those two separate pieces. Gandalf was a very useful character in that regard because he was the common link between Frodo's quest, which he after all had sent Frodo off on, and Aragorn's fate. And he was really driving both stories, and so we would take time out, as Tolkien does in the book, really, to speak to that, and to speak to the bigger conflict that Gandalf has with Sauron.
Gandalf then tells Aragorn,
"Do not regret your decision to leave him. Frodo must finish this task alone."
And Aragorn replies that Frodo is not alone, as Sam went with him. Gandalf is pleased to hear this, indicating that his original expectation was presumably for Frodo to travel alone, and for Gollum to assist him in some way.
My heart tells me that Gollum has some part to play yet.
Of course, the only reason why Frodo is able to complete his quest is because Sam goes with him, and Gandalf is extremely happy to hear this, both because it will increase the likelihood of success, and because it shows Gandalf how seriously Sam takes his promise.
Don't you leave him, Samwise Gamgee.
This is also referenced earlier in the Fellowship of the Ring.
Don't you lose him, Samwise Gamgee.
Which means that this promise was made as they were leaving the Shire before Gandalf went to Isengard. At this point, their intention was to carry the ring to Rivendell and nothing more.
We did what Gandalf wanted, didn't we? We got the ring this far.
The context of this promise, at the time it was made, was that Sam would keep Frodo safe on the way to Rivendell. What ended up happening, of course, is that Sam decided to accompany Frodo all the way to Mount Doom, which Gandalf would not have expected or predicted. And Gandalf's response indicates that he is constantly surprised and impressed by the bravery and loyalty of hobbits. This scene could be described as unnecessary, because the plot information we get is information we get elsewhere. The audience already knows all of this, however, Aragorn only knows some of this. Gandalf preparing Aragorn for what they are about to do in Rohan also helps clarify things for the audience and establishes a clear plan of attack. The reason why I think this scene should absolutely be in the film is the manner by which Gandalf encourages Aragorn to fulfill his destiny. The direct reference to Frodo, which greatly helps to maintain a sense of narrative cohesion, and Gandalf being very happy to hear that Sam went with Frodo. It also functions as a calm before the storm, before these characters are thrust into the ongoing conflict already taking place in Rohan. This section of the extended edition of The Two Towers is, admittedly, quite slow. In both versions, the sequence with Frodo, Sam and Gollum at the Black Gate is cut between Gandalf's return and their arrival at Edoras. However, the extended edition also includes 2 additional scenes either side of the Black Gate scene, which means that where it takes a total of 6 minutes from picking up Shadowfax to arriving at Edoras in the theatrical edition, the extended edition drags this out to a total of nearly 15 minutes. If we remove both of the Fangorn scenes and keep the Heir of Numenor scene, the film improves overall due to its content, and the impact this scene has upon pacing is negligible, provided both Fangorn scenes are removed. I am not going to penalise this particular scene just because the other extended scenes surrounding it are not particularly good, and so it is going solidly in A because of what it communicates and how clearly it communicates it. I have been waiting for this one, and before I say mean things about the Ent Draft scene, let me remind you that I love both versions of The Lord of the Rings, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to criticise them. Merry wakes up in Fangorn Forest, and Treebeard has not returned. Pippin is drinking from the stream and tells Merry that he had a lovely dream in which the two of them smoked a barrel of pipeweed, and Merry vomited. Pippin then stretches, and Merry observes that Pippin just said something in tree-ish. Merry then realizes that Pippin is suddenly taller than him, and they bicker about who is normally the tall one. Realizing that he is now the short one, Merry drinks a load of the magic water whilst Pippin tries to stop him, and they are attacked by a semi-sentient tree. Treebeard then returns and tells the tree that no means no, and it releases the hobbits. Treebeard then tells the hobbits that the forest is waking up and that it isn't safe, repurposing dialogue from the theatrical edition a couple of scenes prior.
Anger festers in their hearts, black are their thoughts. Strong is their hate, they will harm you if they can.
In a film that was, fairly unrelentingly grim and tense, which The Two Towers is, we did think that we should lighten it up and we should have some more whimsy.
Okay, so, on its most basic level, as a scene in The Two Towers, the extended Ent Draft scene does not accomplish anything meaningful or relevant. Merry and Pippin fighting over magic tree water does not have anything to do with any of the plot threads of The Lord of the Rings. And, forgive me for making this comparison, like many scenes in the Hobbit trilogy, this scene can be removed entirely and cleanly without affecting the rest of the film. In the commentary track, whilst discussing a different scene, Fran Walsh talks about the difficulty of introducing new characters.
The introduction of characters has always been a challenge, and it's a drag really to have to do it, because you want to get on with the storytelling, and the notion of having to introduce someone before you can actually engage them with the plot is boring.
Fran Walsh considers being boring to be a bad thing, and she considers the idea of halting narrative progression in order to introduce a character to be boring and therefore bad. Her solution to this potential writing problem is to introduce characters at the same time as accomplishing some other goal. The Council of Elrond scene being a fantastic example of this, as it serves as character introductions for both Legolas and Gimli, and yet the scene is not about either Legolas or Gimli.
You have to attempt to introduce them whilst you're unfolding the plot. It's kind of like folding in the eggs while you've got the sugar and the milk and you're kind of mixing it all up together, and hopefully people haven't really noticed that you've also served up a bunch of introductions while you have also involved them in, the premise of some piece of
The scars
action.
of introducing 12 characters in the Fellowship had barely healed.
What Fran Walsh is talking about here is efficient writing. The Ent Draft scene does not introduce any new characters, but this quote is still highly relevant because the whole principle of accomplishing multiple things at once in storytelling is fundamental. In the case of films, this often relates strictly to pacing because you do not have an unlimited amount of runtime in which to tell your story. If you have 10 characters to introduce and you attended the Zack Snyder School of Character Writing, you may think it a good idea to dedicate 5 to 10 minutes of your film showing us each character's backstory without actually advancing the plot. If you do this, then you are wasting time and destroying any sense of narrative momentum, or, in layman's terms, boring the shit out of your audience. This is why the Ent Draft extended scene was removed, because it does not accomplish multiple things. It functions only as a scene in which Merry and Pippin goof around for 5 minutes. The previous Fangorn scene ended with Treebeard leaving the hobbits to sleep, and this scene ends with him picking them up again so that they can continue their journey, which means that this scene could easily be deleted, as it was in the theatrical edition. In terms of the comedic content, it is very exaggerated and tonally inappropriate, particularly given that this scene is placed immediately after the Black Gate scene. Merry and Pippin are somewhat comedic characters throughout the trilogy, but they are not petty and jealous children who bicker over meaningless bullshit. Yes, you could say that they behaved like this when we first met them.
Just stick it in the ground.
It is in the ground.
Outside.
That was your idea.
Why are you so upset? It's only a couple of carrots.
And some cabbages.
Yes, Pippin.
But by portraying them in this way nearly 5 hours into the trilogy, this scene undercuts and undermines the growth they supposedly had in the Fellowship of the Ring. And it is extremely difficult to believe that these two characters are the same two characters who, a few days earlier, attempted to sacrifice their lives to give Frodo a chance to escape. In terms of the character information present within this scene, it depicts Merry as jealous, oblivious, and vain, and it depicts Pippin as a greedy and comical idiot. It also depicts Treebeard as careless, as he goes on to deliver the same dialogue he delivered in the theatrical edition previously, and he explains that the trees have grown wild and dangerous, and that the forest is not safe. This makes his decision to leave Merry and Pippin on their own to sleep on the forest floor extremely confusing. because he promised Gandalf that he would keep them safe, only to knowingly leave them asleep in an unsafe location for no discernible reason. It is also extremely lucky that Treebeard returned when he did, otherwise the hobbits may have suffocated or been crushed, or worse if the evil dead is anything to go by. The scene then closes out with Pippin asking why there are so few Ents, and Treebeard explains that there are no Ent children because they lost the Entwives and now they cannot find them. He asks the hobbits if they have seen the Entwives, Pippin asks what they look like, and Treebeard says that he cannot remember. This exchange gives Treebeard a bit more depth and perhaps informs his apathy regarding what is happening elsewhere in Middle-earth. The Ent Draft sequence plays out like a comedy skit that feels extremely out of place in The Lord of the Rings. There are plenty of moments of comedy in The Lord of the Rings, and most of these jokes work, or at the very least do not detract from the films. However, that is very much not the case with this particular sequence. The Ent Draft scene consists almost entirely of jokes and gags, and does not advance anything in terms of character or plot. Arguably, in fact, it does the opposite by regressing Merry and Pippin's character growth. If this scene was very brief, then I would not be quite as harsh as I am being, but this scene is instead 4.5 minutes long, making it the second longest extended scene in The Two Towers and the third longest in the entire trilogy, which is an exceptionally long time to dedicate to this kind of irrelevant and out-of-place humour.
It's a shame that the first thing that gets cut, for length reasons, is always comedy, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's always the light-hearted stuff, because you just realise that this is not critical to the plot, and when you're out on an assassination mission to try to get rid of scenes that aren't critical to the plot,
I don't think that this scene is actually garbage, because there are good elements to it. However, it dramatically slows down the pacing of the film, particularly because it comes very shortly after the previous Fangorn scene. This scene is entirely removed in the theatrical edition, and the earlier one was dramatically shortened to just 40 seconds, meaning that the extended edition of The Two Towers spends about 7 minutes showing Treebeard reciting poems and Merry and Pippin messing around with magic water. For comparison, the prologue in The Fellowship of the Ring is almost exactly 7 minutes long, and it is probably the most impressive 7 minutes of the entire trilogy in terms of the amount and clarity of information being conveyed. In conclusion, none of this is necessary. All of it can be cut without affecting any plot threads or character arcs. It only features 3 characters, and arguably does minor damage to all 3 of them. All of it dramatically slows the film down, and so, hey, I need to use the garbage tier for something, and if any scene in the extended editions is worthy of this dubious honor, then it is this one. Sorry, Ent Draft, you are going in the garbage. Fast forward to the King of the Golden Hall scene, and we get a very minor change. In the theatrical edition, after throwing Wormtongue down the stairs, Theoden prepares to execute him for treason. Aragorn prevents him from doing so, and Wormtongue then runs away. In the extended edition, Aragorn reaches out to help Wormtongue to his feet, but instead of accepting this gesture, Wormtongue spits on Aragorn's hand. This change shows Aragorn as being merciful, and further contrasts his behaviour with Theoden's. It also shows that Wormtongue is really, really evil and shit because he spits on the guy who just saved his life. Anyway, this does actually feed into a later extended scene, in which Wormtongue describes Aragorn's ring to Saruman, and this scene clearly shows how Wormtongue could have seen it up close. How important this is, we will get to later. Overall, this change is very small, amounting to about 10 seconds of extra footage, and it primarily reinforces Aragorn's mercy that is already present in both cuts, and shows how detestable and dishonourable Wormtongue is. This characterization is a bit more exaggerated than I would prefer, but given how short this change is, I don't have a particularly strong opinion on its inclusion, and so I am going to place it in C. Next up is the Funeral of Theodred. In the theatrical edition, after dealing with Wormtongue, Theoden asks where his son is, and we cut directly to him mourning his loss at Theodred's grave. The extended edition instead gives us a scene depicting Theodred's funeral. There isn't a huge amount for me to say in terms of the narrative content of this scene, as all that actually happens is that Eowyn sings a song as Theodred is buried, and we then abruptly, dramatically, and extremely effectively cut to the next scene with Theoden standing at the grave. However, just because this scene doesn't really contain any narrative content does not necessarily mean that it is not worthy of inclusion. Theoden maintains his composure during the funeral, only breaking down in tears afterwards when speaking to Gandalf, which shows that he is both in shock at having lost his son, and the fact that this happened whilst he was under the control of Saruman. Saruman is directly responsible for Theodred's death, and Saruman is also the reason why Theoden didn't care about or even react to Theodred's death until after Gandalf unscrambled his brain. Saruman took Theoden's son from him, and if not for Gandalf's arrival, Theoden wouldn't have even noticed. This is all present in the theatrical edition, but I think it is definitely more effective in the extended edition, given that we see the process of Theoden burying his son, which further delays Theoden's emotional response to his loss. This scene is also relatively brief, clocking in at about 1 minute and 20 seconds, whereas had the film instead spent 5 minutes burying an extremely minor character, then this would have had a far greater impact upon the pacing of the film. Overall, I like this scene a lot. However, given that the following scene with Theoden and Gandalf exists in both cuts, I can absolutely see why the actual funeral was removed. Because again, these films are very long, and I don't think the emotional impact of this scene is quite enough for it to warrant an A, again, given that Theoden breaking down into tears is present in both versions of the film. I am therefore going to place the Funeral of Theodred in B. Next up, we have a fantastic scene that does not appear in the theatrical edition, Brego, and the theatrical edition is weaker for its exclusion. Aragorn enters the Edoras stables and notices a horse that is clearly not having a particularly good time. The stable masters inform him that the horse is mad, and they appear unable to control him. Aragorn approaches the horse and speaks to it softly in Elvish, removes the reins, and manages to make the horse chill out. Éowyn watches all of the above and informs Aragorn that the horse is named Brego and that he belonged to Theodred. As Aragorn continues to speak to Brego in Elvish, Éowyn is fascinated by the effect he is having upon the horse, not to mention the effect he is having upon her front bottom.
I've heard of the magic of elves, but did not look for it in a ranger from the north.
Aragorn informs her that he was raised in Rivendell, and he tells her to release Brego as he has seen enough of war. So this may appear on a casual glance to be a rather pointless scene. Aragorn calms a horse down and tells Éowyn to release it. However, this scene feeds directly into an important plot beat later in the film. Brego is released off-screen and then returns to rescue Aragorn after the Warg attack. Aragorn helped Brego by calming and releasing him, and Brego later returns to Aragorn to carry him to safety.
It's a horse that doesn't really appear in the books at all, but we knew that Viggo had to be picked up by a horse when he was left for dead after the Warg scene, which is coming up. And so we wanted to somehow establish a bond between him and this horse which comes to save him. Ultimately, when we did the theatrical cut, that seemed like unnecessary setup, but it's a nice scene that does show how Aragorn's raising with the elves and his connection with horses as a ranger.
This vaguely parallels Aragorn's own history, in that Aragorn and Brego wanted to be free, and each of them then decided to return to their duty, as a king and as a warhorse. It is also notable that Brego was Theodred's horse prior to his death, which means that Aragorn, the future king of Gondor, is rescued by Brego, the horse belonging to the Prince of Rohan, which has parallels with certain events that take place in The Return of the King.
Viggo was really upset this scene wasn't in. It just explains so much about so many different things. It explains about his relationship with Miranda's character. It explains his relationship with his horse. It explains an awful lot about him, his character. It explains a lot about Viggo too.
I was trying to find the scene. Where was the moment where Éowyn falls in love with Aragorn? Where is it that she sort of crosses over that line? I think at first she's a little threatened by him, but also fascinated by him. But I was looking for the point where she actually becomes enamoured of him. And we always thought it would be in this scene.
So, how realistic is it that a horse would be able to find Aragorn? I'll be honest, I know nothing about horses. They scare me, they have giant heads and weird nibbly teeth, and I thank the god that I don't believe in every time I see a horse for not making them carnivorous. As far as I am aware, though, horses are among the most intelligent animals that exist. And as Brego was the horse belonging to the Prince of Rohan, we can be pretty damn sure that Brego is a near-perfect galaxy-brained specimen of a steed. So when you combine this with Aragorn's experience with animals and the magic of elves, I don't think it is beyond the realm of possibility that Brego could follow Aragorn. Alternatively, this could just be blind luck and Brego was kinda chilling by the river when Aragorn fell in, who knows. In the theatrical edition, this isn't a question that needs asking, because we never had the setup in the stable, which means that this horse that rescues Aragorn is just some random horse. And there were, of course, multiple horses nearby during the Warg attack, and so one that lost its rider could easily have come down to the water for a drink and found Aragorn. This scene also serves as the first time that Aragorn properly interacts with Éowyn, whereas in the theatrical edition their first interaction is when he interrupts her when she is swinging her sword around and he observes her skill. In the theatrical edition, Aragorn is interested in Éowyn, although not in a romantic way, because he is impressed by her skills with a sword. In the extended edition, their first conversation comes about due to her interest in him, because she is impressed by his skill at bonding with animals and his use of elvish magic. This slightly changes the nature of their relationship, for the better, because in the extended edition, it is initiated by Éowyn.
We shot another scene after this, which ended up in the film, which is the scene with the sword with Aragorn, which I still sort of prefer, really, only because I think she comes across a little passive in this scene, and I was interested in her being stronger than that.
I disagree slightly with Miranda Otto's commentary here, because I think that as Éowyn's romantic feelings for Aragorn are not reciprocated, it works slightly better to have their first interaction be as a result of her fascination with him, rather than the other way around. Overall, this scene is fantastic. Even if it didn't set up Brego rescuing Aragorn and all of the accompanying thematic threads, the tweaks it makes to Aragorn and Éowyn's relationship are excellent. You could argue that, from a strict narrative perspective, we don't need any setup for the horse that rescues Aragorn later, but without this setup, he's just rescued by a horse, and there is no deeper symbolic meaning to it. The Brego scene isn't quite important enough for me to give it an S, however it is absolutely worthy of being on the top side of A. Next up is a new scene only present in the extended edition involving Saruman and Wormtongue, the Ring of Barahir. Wormtongue tells Saruman of the three who followed Gandalf. Saruman is interested in the man, asking if he is from Gondor, and Wormtongue says that he thinks the man was a Dunedain ranger.
He bore a strange ring.
So this is the payoff for the earlier deleted moment where Wormtongue sees Aragorn's ring, and Saruman identifies the ring as the Ring of Barahir. The scene does not elaborate on what exactly the Ring of Barahir is, but Saruman concludes that Gandalf believes that the bearer of the Ring of Barahir is Isildur's heir. Presumably, this ring was worn by Isildur thousands of years prior, and this is why Saruman draws this connection, although we do not actually see any evidence of this in either version of the film. I wasn't expecting to find anything particularly juicy in the commentary track for this scene, but when Christopher Lee, the legend that he was, just spontaneously starts explaining the importance of the Ring of Barahir, who am I to turn down the opportunity to drop this explanation into my video?
Barahir was one of the great lords from the north in the First Age, and he had this ring, and it was handed down over thousands of years probably, and eventually it came into the possession of Isildur, which of course is never mentioned in the film. He's after the One Ring. So Wormtongue is saying this belongs to Aragorn. And I think it's an important scene because it does show that Gandalf's resurrection, of which Saruman is well aware, of course, has made things very awkward for him.
Saruman concludes by saying that Gandalf is a fool and that the world of men will fall regardless. In amongst all this, we get some slightly out-of-place comic relief.
You stink of horse.
Which, as much as I love me some Christopher Lee, does not seem like something that Saruman the White would ever say. This scene also depicts Saruman's confidence in his impending victory over Rohan, which is nice to have, but not something that requires an entire scene and 90 seconds of screen time to portray. The Ring of Barahir itself is not mentioned again, and the mechanical purpose it serves is to inform Saruman that Gandalf thinks he has found the heir to the throne of Gondor. But this does not inform any of Saruman's future actions.
And this is an extra scene for the DVD that we didn't use it in the theatrical cut, but it's basically giving Saruman the information that Aragorn, the supposed lost king, is out and about. It was ultimately information that we didn't think Saruman needed to know.
Saruman knowing or not knowing about Aragorn is entirely unimportant to the plot of The Lord of the Rings. This scene, therefore, functions as exposition, but the exposition being exposited doesn't actually matter. What it adds to the story is some minor characterization for Saruman and Wormtongue, which helps make them feel more fleshed out within the setting. However, as I mentioned, none of this characterization plays into either of their future actions. The scene also takes up far too much screen time given its content, and so as much as I will cherish every second of Christopher Lee in these movies, I have to give this scene a D. The next couple of changes take place during the Daughter of Kings scene, although neither of these changes have anything to do with Éowyn. As Edoras evacuates, Theoden tells Gamling to bring him his horse.
This is not a defeat. We will return.
And he then repeats, "We will return," after Gamling has left the room. Theoden is just as much reassuring himself as he is reassuring Gamling. This is a great character moment and shows Theoden's resolve, competence, and care for his people, but also shows that he is not blind to the danger Saruman poses. He needs to be strong and he needs to lead his people, and showing him with a degree of vulnerability and uncertainty makes him far more relatable and understandable. The next change is extremely minor. In the theatrical edition, Theoden watches his people, as a collective, evacuate Edoras. In the extended edition, we get two new shots. One of Aragorn helping to escort the peasants, and another showing the two children who escaped the burning of the Westfold earlier. This amounts to a total of 4 seconds of deleted footage, and I have no idea why this would ever be cut. By specifically showing these two kids from earlier, it helps to personify the citizens of Rohan, rather than just having them be a faceless horde of peasants. This is the exact same reason why, in the prelude to the Helm's Deep battle, there is a scene of Aragorn encouraging a young boy, telling him that there is always hope. I would never in a million years suggest removing this scene because, yes, it does eat up runtime, but it is also a crucial part of an extremely effective whole, resulting in a pitch-perfect tone leading into the pivotal battle. This 2-second shot of a couple of kids on a horse is nowhere near as important as the Helm's Deep scene, but it accomplishes a similar thing. Additionally, given that these kids show up later reuniting with their mother at Helm's Deep, it isn't like the filmmakers chose to simply forget about them in the theatrical edition, and so removing this specific shot makes absolutely no sense to me. These two changes are small, but they are relatively important in characterizing Theoden and helping to make sure the audience cares about his people. The changes to this scene are never going to be in my list of the best changes in the extended edition because of how small they are, but even so, I can't put this any lower than A tier. Everything about the extra footage is deliberate and purposeful, and I do not understand why you would ever remove it. Up next is Faramir's introduction in the scene of Herbs and Stewed Rabbit. In the theatrical edition, the hobbits are captured by the Rangers of Ithilien, led by Faramir, and the scene is edited so as to be about as brief as conceivably possible. Faramir looks at the hobbits, orders his men to bind their hands, and then we cut directly to the following scene. In the theatrical edition, we do not learn anything about Faramir until his next appearance nearly half an hour later. In the extended edition, however, Sam and Frodo protest and try to explain themselves.
Wait! We're innocent travelers! Those that claim to oppose the enemy would do well not to hinder us.
And this prompts a monologue from Faramir, which is too long for me to play here, thank you YouTube gods, so I shall instead read it to you. The enemy, his sense of duty was no less than yours, I deem. You wonder what his name is, where he came from, and if he was really evil at heart. What lies or threats led him on this long march from home, if he would not rather have stayed there in peace. This monologue appears in the book, although it appears as an internal monologue from Sam. By repurposing this as dialogue for Faramir, the writers immediately establish Faramir as a very reluctant soldier. At this point, we know nothing of his history, we don't even know his name yet, but by introducing him to us as a man who kills and yet deeply questions the morality of his actions, it makes him very sympathetic and heightens the mystery as to his intentions. In the theatrical edition, he is introduced as man who kills baddies and mistakenly identifies the hobbits as spies. In the extended edition, he is introduced as a man who kills his enemies, who questions why his enemies are his enemies, regrets the fact that he is forced to kill his enemies, and tortures himself by imagining that perhaps this particular enemy was tricked into marching far from his home and fighting against his own interests. Faramir then concludes by saying,
"War will make corpses of us all.
which suggests that he is almost nihilistic. He doesn't know that his enemy is actually his enemy. All he knows is that he needs to kill the other guy before the other guy kills him. Although this is not revealed to the audience yet, Faramir knows at this point that his brother, Boromir, has died, and Denethor, of course, hates Faramir, both of which inform his extremely pessimistic attitude regarding the futility of war.
I think it does a remarkable job of addressing some of the criticisms of Tolkien, because people say that he's racist, people say that he's pro-war, and the words that Faramir says here when he sees the body on the ground, I think, can only have been written by somebody who had first-hand experience of war, as Tolkien had, and despised it. It's the words of a soldier who does not know why he's killing people, does not know why the enemy are supposed to be different to him. And I can just imagine Tolkien in the First World War in the trenches, wondering just how different the Germans are and why they have to kill the Germans and why they deserve to be killed, and do they want to be killed, and are they really evil? And it is very much the thoughts and emotions that I think could only come from a soldier who did not like what he was doing.
This is an excellent point, and a fantastic justification for deviating from the book and repurposing Sam's internal monologue as an external monologue for Faramir. This monologue also introduces a degree of moral ambiguity that has been entirely absent so far, and for the most part will remain absent after this scene. The antagonists of The Lord of the Rings are, broadly, orcs, and orcs are inherently and universally evil creatures who are incapable of being anything else. They are malevolent and hateful, and they are a race that has been corrupted and twisted by the forces of evil. The Two Towers introduces the Easterlings and the Haradrim, two separate factions of men, and whilst these factions are aligned with Sauron, they are not intrinsically evil in the same way that the orcs are. The moral ambiguity of war and the nature of good and evil are themes that, for the most part, are not present in The Lord of the Rings. The goodies are good, and the baddies are bad. I am not interested in getting caught in the weeds and arguing over whether or not Sauron and Morgoth are actually evil, because honestly I do not have an encyclopedic knowledge of Tolkien's work. I'm sure there may be a line in the book somewhere that if you jump through a few hoops and do some backflips while blindfolded, you could maybe interpret as suggesting that Sauron is a morally grey character. I am only pulling from the films because those are what I know, and those are what I am discussing. And in the films, The Lord of the Rings is not a morally complex story. These are the good guys, and these are the bad guys. Good and evil are presented as objective and absolute, and any time we see a character waver from their alignment, it is as a result of them being corrupted or tempted by the One Ring, as in the cases of Gollum, Boromir, and Saruman. We also have Wormtongue, who seems to be a cowardly opportunist who serves Saruman for his own reasons, but he is not explicitly evil in the same way that Sauron is, for example. In the same way, Faramir suggests that the Haradrim soldiers killed by his men are not explicitly evil, and that in another life they could have been allies or even friends. This theme of moral ambiguity does not show up again in The Lord of the Rings, and so you could say that it is strange and out of place to touch on it halfway through the trilogy and then never address it again. However, I would argue that because this theme is communicated through dialogue from Faramir, it is fantastically effective because it hits the audience in the face with questions of moral ambiguity and makes very clear where his head is at. This brand new character is introduced to us, and he immediately ponders the nature of evil and the concept of an enemy. And this happens within a story that is otherwise not particularly concerned with questioning the nature of evil. This highlights the fact that Faramir himself is heavily conflicted. He almost seems out of place within the story, and he is asking questions that no one else is even thinking about. This is a fascinating introduction to the character, and I think is a substantial improvement to his introduction in the theatrical edition. Overall, the changes to Faramir's introduction are excellent. They provide substantial character depth in a very short amount of time, and much like his brother in the Fellowship of the Ring, Faramir is the character who suffers the most through the omission of the various extended scenes in the Two Towers. I am going to place this scene solidly in A tier. Next up, we get some new dialogue from Theoden during the Dwarf Women scene. After Gimli makes Éowyn laugh and then falls off his horse, Theoden tells Aragorn that he has not seen Éowyn smile in a long time. He explains to Aragorn that Éowyn lost both of her parents when she was young, her father was killed by orcs, and her mother succumbed to grief.
And she was left alone.
to tend her king in growing fear, doomed to wait upon an old man who should have loved her as a father.
This change is very minor, and appears to simply be an insert of Theoden explaining Éowyn's backstory. However, there is a little more to this because the writers of The Lord of the Rings are very competent at what they do. Or at least they were very competent at what they were doing when they made The Lord of the Rings. The writers use this as an opportunity not only to tell the audience about Éowyn, but also to suggest that Theoden feels deep regret over the fact that he did not love her as his own child, which connects with a couple of narrative threads within the film. Theoden's own son, Theodred, is now dead, and this has evidently caused Theoden to realize that he may have taken Éowyn's loyalty and service for granted. This also informs Theoden's order that Éowyn lead the people to Helm's Deep when they are ambushed by Saruman's Warg Riders, and when he later orders her to protect the women and children in the caves. He can't bear the thought of losing her.
This piece here of Theoden was really to establish his connection to Éowyn. It has quite a large payoff in film 3, of course. We wanted to use this notion that he should have loved her like a father, and he wasn't there for her. And it also serves the purpose of not just explaining his character, but providing a bit of background information about where this young girl came from and why she might have this attitude to life, which was pretty grim.
This dialogue to Aragorn is not necessary to explain Theoden's actions, as his instructing of Éowyn to protect the people of Rohan is also informed by the fact that he trusts that as a shield maiden of Rohan she will be able to do it, plus the fact that, as revealed in The Return of the King, he intends for her to rule Edoras if he dies in battle.
The people are to follow your rule in my stead. Take up my seat in the Golden Hall. Long may you defend Edoras.
However, the additional explanation that he feels guilt about not loving her as a daughter helps to give their relationship some additional depth by giving them a far more personal and emotional bond rather than purely a practical one. Additionally, a very minor connection, in The Return of the King we get this dialogue.
I would have you smile again.
Which functions perfectly fine on its own, but the mention of the fact that Éowyn has not smiled in a long time in this scene then gives that future moment a tiny bit more context. Overall, the changes to the Dwarf Women scene are very brief, but I do think they support both the characters of Theoden and Éowyn, and although these changes are not entirely necessary, I value them enough to place them in B. Immediately afterwards, we get a brand new scene, one of the Dunedain, also known as Éowyn's Stew. There are elements to this scene that I quite like, and there are elements that I very much do not like. The people of Rohan have taken a break from travelling, and Éowyn takes the opportunity to offer Aragorn some stew that she has made. It tastes like shit, but he nods rather unconvincingly at her and tells her that the stew is good. Before I continue, a quick trigger warning. I'm about to talk about traditional gender roles, but don't worry, I double-checked this next part with my wife, and she reassured me that whilst I am a notorious bigot, I don't actually hate women. Anyway, the fact that Éowyn is a terrible cook highlights the fact that she is not a traditional woman. Granted, due to the lack of women in The Lord of the Rings, we don't really see women fulfilling traditionally feminine roles, such as cooking and cleaning, outside of this scene, but I think given the characterization we get for Éowyn elsewhere in the trilogy, the intention is clear. Middle-earth is a setting in which men and women have separate and clearly defined roles in society.
It's tradition for the women of the court to farewell the men.
Éowyn is repeatedly unable to achieve what she wants to achieve because of the cultural norms of Rohan and Middle-earth in general. She is established as being somewhat competent with a sword, and she believes herself to be as competent as the men, but regardless, the men do the fighting, which she considers to be both unfair and a waste of her talent. Éowyn is depicted as the singular exception to this, which is why I think her character arc succeeds in a way that certain characters in Rings of Power that appear to be superficially similar never will. And showing that Éowyn is terrible at fulfilling a traditionally feminine role in a world in which women are expected to fulfill a traditional role suggests that she spends much of her time focused on things she deems to be more important, such as practicing with her sword or assisting the king. After Aragorn tells her that her stew is good, Éowyn replies,
"Really?"
which suggests that she was not expecting Aragorn to like it, further indicating that she believes herself to be a substandard cook. In the theatrical edition, we know that Éowyn is good at doing masculine things, but the extended edition also shows that she is bad at doing feminine things, which excellently sets up her character for the arc she will go on throughout the rest of the trilogy.
This scene was difficult to decide whether we'd done the right thing, which is one of the reasons I think it didn't end up in the new say, because really this is not correct for Éowyn's character.
I have to say I was very happy when this scene was cut from the film. It was one of those things where they were playing with Éowyn's character, and just sort of when there's so few women in the film, to sort of play with some of the more feminine side and the lighter side of her character. I sometimes just find that Éowyn seems quite girlish.
I mean, that is the entire point of her character. That she is a girl is what makes her exceptional within the story of The Lord of the Rings. And so having her be a girl and be a somewhat feminine character only makes this arc stronger. Éowyn is shit at being a girl, and she wants to be allowed to excel in the same way that the men do on the battlefield.
Basically, she wants to be Theoden's son, I suppose. The female version of that, not to be a man, but to be a woman who stands up in her own right.
So if this was the end of the scene, I would place it towards the top of A. Unfortunately, there is quite a bit more. As Éowyn walks off, satisfied that Aragorn likes her stew, Aragorn begins to pour the stew away before Éowyn turns around and continues talking to him, causing Aragorn to accidentally get hot stew all over himself. This is clearly meant to be funny, and the problem I take with it is that I don't believe that Aragorn would do this. Firstly, one might expect that Aragorn, who has spent years of his life living in the wilderness eating only what he hunts with his bow, would be at least somewhat accustomed to eating food that doesn't taste particularly nice. And secondly, if he truly considers the stew to be inedible, he is surrounded by peasants who are carrying extremely limited provisions.
Take only what provisions you need.
Where's the rest?
This is all we could save, my lady.
And one would expect that Aragorn, as the future king of Gondor, would absolutely offer the stew to someone else when Éowyn's back is turned. That is, unless the joke is that Éowyn's stew is one step away from being literal sewage water, and Aragorn doesn't want to inflict something that ghastly upon anyone, which is possible, but the scene is far more believable and less absurd if the stew is just a not very nice meal. Additionally, if Éowyn's stew is indeed some ungodly cocktail of dead horse, dirty river water, and sand, then this damages her character because it turns her into an idiot who is both incapable of preparing an edible meal and also incapable of realizing that the food she has prepared tastes like raw sewage. The fact is that had Aragorn offered the stew to someone else, then this would have been more in character, but we would have missed the borderline slapstick gag of him accidentally spilling hot soup all over himself whilst pretending that everything is okay. The core of this idea, that Éowyn offers Aragorn some shitty food and he realizes, wow, this food is utter shit, is an idea that could have worked. The way it played out, not so much. Éowyn then says,
My uncle told me a strange thing. He said that you rode to war with Thengel, my grandfather.
Aragorn confirms that this is true, and Éowyn speculates as to his age before he confirms that he is 87 years old. We then get a vague explanation as to what happened to the Dunedain, which is nice to have in terms of establishing a history for Middle-earth, but is not particularly relevant to the story of The Lord of the Rings. What this exchange accomplishes, however, is that it shows that Aragorn is far older, and more importantly, more experienced, than his appearance would suggest. In the theatrical edition, Aragorn's age is never mentioned, and Viggo Mortensen was 40 at the time of filming, which means the audience would assume Aragorn to be of approximately the same age. Confirming that he is both 87 years old and blessed with long life suggests that if he does become the king of Gondor, he will rule for a substantially longer period than the 20 to 30 years he would have ruled for if he was instead 40 and had a regular human lifespan. However, this revelation is actually one reason why Peter Jackson decided to cut the scene.
One of the reasons why it didn't end up in the theatrical version where is that we follow the scene with a flashback to Rivendell, and we build the whole upon relationship between he and Arwen and the fact that he's mortal and she's immortal. And we felt when we were cutting the film that having a scene where he talks about being 87 years old and then in the very next scene saying that he's actually a mortal man, that people will get confused. You know, does he die? Does he grow old? How old can he get? That it is a little bit confusing.
This is a fair point, because Aragorn being a descendant of Numenor, and what that means in terms of his lifespan, is not something that exists in the films outside of this scene. and so I can absolutely understand the fear that the audience could be confused due to the whole mortal versus immortal thing with Arwen. I had never even considered the fact that an audience may interpret Aragorn being 87 but looking about 40 as him being immortal, but to ensure the clarity of the flashback with Arwen, I can understand the decision to remove this. Overall, this scene is absolutely a mixed bag. I thoroughly appreciate the fundamental idea in characterizing Éowyn in this manner. The extra backstory for Aragorn is nice to have, and the dialogue between Éowyn and Aragorn helps to build their relationship. However, the way the disgusting stew gag is handled is flatly too absurd and comedic to take seriously. The impression that the film gives is that Éowyn is so terrible at cooking that Aragorn didn't want to inflict her cooking upon any of the peasants, which is quite a funny concept. But given the dire circumstances they are in, and given that Éowyn has presumably prepared food for King Theoden in the past as a part of her duties, the writers unfortunately cranked how terrible her cooking is way too high, which results in them sacrificing believability in the name of comedy. I am therefore going to place this extended scene in C tier because of how inconsistent it is. In the next extended scene, the Evenstar, we get a couple of minor changes. In the theatrical edition, we cut from Elrond's line, "She stays for you, she belongs with her people," to Aragorn telling Arwen that she has a chance to live a happy life away from him. In the extended edition, we get a brief shot of Aragorn walking away from Elrond after their conversation. The following morning, we see Aragorn preparing to leave Rivendell with the rest of the Fellowship. Arwen then confronts Aragorn, asking if he thought he could slip away unnoticed, and he tells her that he will not be coming back. This change suggests that Aragorn's intention was absolutely to leave without saying goodbye, given that Aragorn was carrying his weapons and was headed towards the rest of the Fellowship as they prepared to depart. This is either because he had decided to make their separation as painless as possible, or because he was overwhelmed with emotion and didn't want to have to tell Arwen that he would not be returning. Or potentially because he thought that leaving without saying goodbye would make Arwen angry, which would then prompt her to take the ship to Valinor. Arwen assumes that Aragorn fears he will die in battle and reassures him that he underestimates his skill, but Aragorn replies that he is not talking about dying in battle, revealing to her that he has decided not to return. Whether or not this is true, Aragorn is telling Arwen that he has decided to end their relationship so that she takes the ship to Valinor. We then get an additional line from Arwen that only appears in the extended edition.
It was a dream, nothing more.
I don't believe you.
At which point, we tie back in with the theatrical edition, where he tells her that she has the chance for another life. This is a nice dialogue exchange, and it allows for slightly more of a build-up before Aragorn tells his love to leave him for her own good. The exact same information is communicated in the theatrical edition, however, in that Aragorn is very conflicted about what Arwen should do. His conversation with Elrond causes him to feel extremely guilty about denying Arwen her immortality, and so he resolves to not return, and asks that she leave for Valinor with the other elves. This was likely trimmed because it is a flashback, and the writers didn't want to distract from the central plot of The Two Towers, where, at this point, the people of Rohan are heading to Helm's Deep. However, the additional footage does very slightly expand upon the nature of Aragorn and Arwen's goodbye. Outside of this, these extended changes do not alter the information communicated within the scene, and so they are largely redundant from a mechanical standpoint. However, the additional dialogue does allow for slightly more of a dramatic build-up leading into Aragorn attempting to cut things off with Arwen. Overall, I like this extended scene, although its impact on the film is minimal, and so I am going to place it in B tier. Next is a very minor change as the peasants arrive at Helm's Deep, and this is another inexplicably tiny change that just makes me shake my head and ask, why the hell did you cut that? Éowyn is sorting through baskets of food, and she asks where the rest is.
This is all we could say, my lady.
And she tells the peasants to take the food into the caves. That's it. 12 seconds.
A little bit of extended DVD footage here, which is really just showing Éowyn's role in what she does at Helm's Deep. I mean, okay, she's led the refugees there, but what does she do when she arrives? Well, she's an organizer. She helps set up the food for them. She plays that sort of part.
It also establishes that they ain't in good shape for a long siege.
This very brief dialogue exchange helps to keep the tension high and establishes that although they have reached the relative safety of Helm's Deep, they don't have as much food as Éowyn was expecting. This is also the first reference to the caves, which is where the women and children hide during the battle, whereas in the theatrical edition, there is no mention of the caves until about 30 minutes later. The only real negative to this is that, in context with the rest of the extended edition, it makes it even more questionable that Aragorn would pour away Éowyn's stew, as this extended scene makes it explicit that the peasants do not have very much food. This change is tiny, but I think it is a strict improvement to the film, and so it goes in A. The Window on the West receives some changes to the dialogue between Faramir and Frodo. In the theatrical edition, after Faramir tells Frodo that Boromir is dead, Frodo asks how and when this happened. Faramir replies that he hoped Frodo would be able to tell him, and he tells Frodo that Boromir was his brother. The extended version of this scene adds in a couple of additional lines. After Faramir says, as one of his companions, "I'd hoped you would tell me," Frodo replies,
"If something has happened to Boromir, we would have you tell us."
Faramir then explains how he knows that Boromir is dead.
His horn washed up upon the riverbank. 6 days past. It was cloven in two. More than this, I know it in my heart. It was my brother.
This change primarily accomplishes two things. Firstly, it shows that Frodo cares about Boromir in a more decisive manner than in the theatrical edition. In the theatrical edition, he is clearly shocked, but he doesn't ask any follow-up questions other than,
"How? When?"
Whereas in the extended edition, Frodo demands that Faramir tell him what he knows. This is relatively unimportant, as Boromir is of course dead by this point, but it is still notable for Frodo's character that, in spite of what happened the last time he saw Boromir, he does still consider him to be a friend, and this is likely informed by his growing understanding of the corrupting influence of the One Ring, which allows him to better contextualize Boromir's actions. Secondly, it tells us how exactly Faramir knows that Boromir is dead, which is not revealed in the theatrical edition until the return of the king. Additionally, the establishing of a time frame,
His horn washed up upon the riverbank. 6 days past.
means that Faramir has known about Boromir's death for some time, and as we are about to see, he still has the Horn of Gondor in his possession. This is a tiny reveal with rather large implications. In the theatrical edition, Denethor has the Horn of Gondor, so we would assume that Faramir learned of Boromir's death through Denethor. In the extended edition, however, Faramir has the Horn of Gondor, which means that Denethor doesn't yet know, which means that Faramir has not yet been back to Minas Tirith to tell him, and so Faramir will at this point be dreading having to tell his father that his favoured son has died, all of which heavily informs his decision to take the ring to Denethor in a later scene. We then see a surreal sequence in which Faramir watches Boromir's corpse being carried down the River Anduin.
The idea that Faramir is Boromir's brother is obviously spoken about, but I always think it's much stronger to have things visual, see them in pictures rather than just hear people discussing it in dialogue. So these scenes were shot as a way of linking the two characters together.
On its own, this change could seem unnecessary as it relates exclusively to the character of Faramir, but given that this scene feeds directly into a brand new scene that is rather important, I think these changes work excellently by informing us of Faramir's state of mind, and when combined with the following scene, help to explain his future actions with regard to Frodo and the ring. This short scene is definitely elevated by what follows it, and in isolation it is merely good rather than very good, but in context with the rest of the extended edition, and in context with the far more developed character of Faramir that appears in the extended edition, this scene earns its place in A. We now come to the Sons of the Steward. Those of you who have watched my final autopsy of the Hobbit trilogy will have already heard me gush about this scene, but I am now going to gush about it once more, because it is just that fucking good. It's going in S, by the way, the top of S. Sons of the Steward is an extended flashback that takes place in Osgiliath sometime during the first half of the Fellowship of the Ring. This flashback shows us, in detail, the relationship between Boromir, Faramir, and Denethor. This scene is also the first time we see Osgiliath, whereas in the theatrical edition, this does not happen until Faramir takes the hobbits there, which means that there is a contrast between Osgiliath after a victory and Osgiliath during a defeat. Anyway, Boromir has recently achieved victory over the orcs, driving them out of the city. After addressing his soldiers, he breaks out the ale with Faramir and says,
"Remember today, little brother. Today, life is good."
Denethor then arrives, interrupting the merrymaking and pissing off both Boromir and Faramir. However, Boromir greets Denethor so as to maintain appearances. It becomes clear that Denethor praises Boromir for his achievement in retaking Osgiliath, whereas he directly blames Faramir for losing it in the first place, and Boromir unsuccessfully attempts to defend his brother.
You give him no credit, and yet he tries to do your will.
Denethor then reveals to Boromir in private that Elrond has called a secret meeting, and Denethor believes that the purpose of the meeting is that the One Ring has been found. He tells Boromir that the ring must come to Gondor, and considers Boromir to be the only person he trusts who is capable of retrieving it. The reason Denethor desperately wants the ring is because Sauron's forces are growing stronger, and he fears that Gondor will fall unless they are able to utilize the weapon of the enemy. Denethor also refers to the One Ring as a gift.
Bring me back this mighty gift.
Which then gives further context to Boromir's line during the Council of Elrond.
The ring is altogether evil. It is a gift to the foes of Mordor.
However, Boromir refuses to leave his people, prompting Faramir to offer to go instead. Denethor begins to mock Faramir, and Boromir then begrudgingly accepts the mission. He repeats the line from earlier,
"Remember today, little brother."
But this time he does not finish with "life is good." Faramir would remember this day as the last time he saw his brother. So this is a very rich scene in terms of characterization, and it is responsible for adding a huge amount of depth to all three of its characters. Let's start by looking at what this scene does for Faramir. As this scene takes place prior to everything going tits up, we get to see Boromir and Faramir's relationship, a relationship which is entirely absent in the theatrical edition. Faramir has tried repeatedly to impress his father.
Always you cast a poor reflection on me.
Which then adds context to their interactions in The Return of the King, as well as his temptation to take the ring to his father in order to impress him.
A chance for Faramir, Captain of Gondor, to show his quality.
Chance for Faramir, Captain of Gondor, to show his quality.
This relationship between the father and the two sons is actually great drama and incredibly important in understanding Faramir's character. It was also great. Fran and I always wanted to make sense of the line, a chance for Faramir, Captain of Gondor, to show his quality, which was a strange line, and we wanted to find an opportunity to make sense of that, because it's also a beautiful line reprised by Sam in this extended cut.
You've shown your quality, sir.
Like Boromir, Faramir is given the perfect opportunity to impress Denethor. In the theatrical edition, Faramir is later tempted to take the ring from Frodo because it's super evil and shit and it corrupts the hearts of men, etc., which is very similar to how Boromir is depicted in The Fellowship of the Ring. In the extended edition, it is not anywhere near that simple, as Faramir also has a perfectly rational and justifiable reason to want to take the ring to his father. In spite of the fact that Faramir is treated extremely poorly by his father, and the fact that Boromir is far more impressive than he is, Faramir neither resents his father nor is he jealous of his brother. He constantly tries to live up to their expectations, even suggesting that he go to Rivendell instead of Boromir after Boromir refuses. It is also very interesting that Denethor later tells Faramir that he wishes he had sent Faramir, believing at this point that Faramir would have died instead, whereas this extended scene shows us that Denethor mocked Faramir for making this exact suggestion previously. Faramir is also given a specific reason to value Osgiliath beyond it just being another part of Gondor, which helps to contextualize his suicide charge later in The Return of the King. By which point, Osgiliath has been taken by the orcs after Boromir had vowed that this would never happen again. Finally, this scene makes Faramir's heartbreaking line to his father in The Return of the King even more devastating, given that we actually see the disdain Denethor had for Faramir even prior to Boromir's death.
You wish now that our places had been exchanged, that I had died and Boromir had lived.
Next up, Denethor. The first clear observation is that this is our first introduction to the character of Denethor, whereas in the theatrical edition, we do not meet him until much later in The Return of the King. Denethor's relationship with Boromir is also something that is not present in the theatrical edition, and we only learn after Boromir's death that Denethor loved his son, which doesn't really tell us very much about their relationship. Denethor is shown to be highly conscious of how he presents himself to his people, making sure to congratulate Boromir.
They say you vanquished the enemy almost single-handed.
Whilst also reminding Faramir of how much he sucks.
Always you cast a poor reflection on me.
This is later contrasted with how he presents himself in The Return of the King, where he doesn't seem to give too much of a shit about his appearance due to his grief. Denethor is also seemingly so enthralled by Boromir's presence that he doesn't even notice Faramir until partway through their conversation, suggesting either that he cares so little for him that he doesn't notice him when he is standing right there, or that he is pretending to ignore him so as to punish Faramir for his perceived inadequacy. Regardless of to what degree Faramir is deserving of any blame, in his father's eyes, his sons are opposites. One is Gondor's finest, the other is Faramir.
There was a series of losses, and I don't discount at all the loss of the wife, the mother of his two sons. I don't discount that. I think that's an incredible wrench that breaks him, but he would never show this. And then he's left to bring up these two boys, one who appears to be in his image, and the other one who doesn't. And if indeed you could go to the extent that Faramir perhaps reminds him of the wife, how painful is that? That he looks at Faramir and feels the grief and the loss of the wife.
We learn in The Return of the King that Denethor treats Faramir like Aragorn treats Eowyn's stew, and it is entirely possible to read from the theatrical edition that at least part of the reason why Denethor despises Faramir is because of the fact that his favourite son has at this point been killed. We learn in this extended scene, however, that Faramir was treated like shit even when Boromir was alive. Denethor is also shown to be intelligent and at least somewhat competent as a leader, which is very much not how he is portrayed in the theatrical edition of The Return of the King. He reveals his belief that the purpose of Elrond's meeting in Rivendell is to decide the fate of the One Ring. In the books, Denethor has a palantir. However, as this is omitted from the film, we can only speculate as to what resources Denethor utilized to draw this conclusion. Denethor believes that everyone Elrond has summoned will attempt to claim the ring for themselves, and he believes that he cannot allow this to happen, as Gondor needs it more than anyone else. He believes that if Boromir does not go to Rivendell, the wizards, the elves, or the dwarves will end up with the ring, that they will not use it to help Gondor, and that Gondor will subsequently fall to Sauron's forces. This is somewhat paranoid, but given that Gondor has been single-handedly keeping Mordor at bay for quite some time, it is entirely justifiable for Denethor to believe this. He considers the elves, dwarves, and wizards to be selfish assholes for not assisting Gondor, and he considers it extremely unjust that his people are the ones paying the price. And what better person to return to Gondor with this mighty gift than his firstborn, Boromir? Denethor thinks so highly of Boromir that he suggests that the ring will not corrupt him.
Ever the ring will seek to corrupt the hearts of lesser men, but you are strong.
This, of course, further adds to the tragedy of Boromir's fall in the Fellowship of the Ring, and it helps to reinforce the power level of the ring, if a man so heroic and noble as Boromir can be corrupted by it. Denethor is depicted as a far more competent and reasonable man than he is in the theatrical edition, partly because we get to see him prior to his being consumed by grief. He has a totally rational and reasonable explanation for wanting the ring and for sending Boromir to retrieve it. He loves his people, and he wants to prevent their suffering. And finally, the character who suffered the most from the removal of certain scenes in the Fellowship of the Ring continues to suffer with the removal of certain scenes in the Two Towers. Sons of the Steward expands upon the already fantastic character as seen in the extended edition of the Fellowship of the Ring by showing us the events that preceded his arrival in Rivendell. First off, Boromir vows that the land of his people will never again fall into enemy hands, which tragically appears to have been in vain as very shortly after he was killed in the Fellowship of the Ring, Osgiliath fell once again to the orcs. We see that, in spite of the fact that Denethor held Boromir in high esteem, Boromir did not particularly like his father using him to make himself look good, not to mention his poor treatment of Faramir.
Oh, one moment of peace can he not give us that?
Where is he?
You give him no credit, and yet he tries to do your will.
Boromir absolutely thinks himself a man of the people who serves Gondor first and his father second, and he would quite like to put his feet up with his brother after a hard-won victory. Boromir's initial refusal to go to Rivendell is also very interesting. His reaction to Denethor's suggestion that the ring has been found tells us very clearly that he is aware of what the One Ring is, And the fact that he refers to the ring as Isildur's bane informs us that he was also very aware of what the ring did to Isildur. Boromir did not want to go to Rivendell because he did not want to end up like Isildur. He did not want to fail and forsake everything he loves. This, absolutely fantastically, recontextualizes everything Boromir did in the Fellowship of the Ring. Not only was his end tragic, but his entire narrative within that film was tragic, because he did not want to be there. He knew what may well happen to him, and yet he was still unable to fight it. His fears became true. Additionally, without this scene, the presumption is that most, or perhaps all, of Boromir's attempts to claim the ring were a manifestation of his corruption, courtesy of the ring itself. With this scene, we understand very clearly why Boromir needed the ring to go to Gondor, even if the ring were not corrupting him. Finally, Boromir then changes his mind about going to Rivendell after looking at the flag bearing the white tree, after Denethor says he will only trust Boromir with the mission, and after Faramir attempts to go instead. Boromir is reminded of why he does what he does. He realizes that in order to protect his kingdom and his family, he has no choice but to go to Rivendell and attempt to claim the ring for Gondor. The reason this scene was cut is fairly clear. It does not advance the story of Frodo. It is an extended flashback that exclusively deals with 3 side characters, one of whom is dead. On a purely mechanical level, this scene is not necessary to tell the story of the Lord of the Rings. However, Sons of the Steward is one of the best scenes in the trilogy. It adds an incredible amount of depth for 3 important side characters in approximately 4.5 minutes. For context, this scene is only 2 seconds longer than the Ent Draft extended scene earlier in the film, and the differences in terms of depth of characterization, efficiency, and impact upon the trilogy is incredible. Where Ent Draft was a waste of time, Sons of the Steward is a fantastically rich expansion upon 3 characters who are drastically elevated in the extended edition. Whilst I do understand the decision to cut this scene due to its length and subject matter, the characters of Boromir, Faramir, and Denethor all suffer tremendously from its exclusion, as does the theatrical edition as a whole. This scene is the reason to watch the extended edition of The Two Towers, and so, as I said earlier, Sons of the Steward goes at the top of S. Up next, during the Forbidden Pool scene, we have some additional footage showing Faramir's men beating up Smeagol, which was likely trimmed for violence. In the theatrical edition, the Rangers don't actually ever hit Smeagol. They throw him to the floor, then we cut to Faramir, then we see Smeagol scrambling away from the soldiers, and then Faramir asks Smeagol where he is taking the hobbits. This is extremely tame by comparison, and thereby changes how the audience will perceive both Faramir and Smeagol. The extended edition instead shows the soldiers kicking Smeagol after throwing him to the floor. Then we cut to Faramir, who is not watching the abuse despite having ordered it. Smeagol tries to crawl away, but is dragged back and punched in the stomach, before Faramir tells his men that's enough. His men then throw Smeagol into the wall of the cave, and Faramir asks Smeagol where he is taking the hobbits.
The interrogation scene was something that used to be quite violent, and we trimmed it right back for the theatrical release, and the DVD has a little bit more of the violence put back into it. Just a sense that Gollum's being, what's the word? Softened up.
This is an excellent example of how a couple of additional seconds of violence can have large ripple effects throughout the rest of the story. In the theatrical edition, Faramir interrogates Smeagol using the threat of violence as leverage. His men are absolutely rough in their handling of Smeagol, but they do not straight up attack him as they do in the extended edition. The reason why I think the extended edition is an improvement here is because it helps to inform Smeagol's decision to betray Frodo. In the theatrical edition, Frodo lures Smeagol into a trap, resulting in Smeagol being bagged, manhandled, and questioned. His reason for betraying Frodo is rationalized as Smeagol believes that his master betrayed him. In the extended edition, Frodo's perceived betrayal results in Smeagol being severely beaten before being interrogated, with the clear threat that the beating will continue if he does not cooperate. All of this also further depicts Smeagol as a highly sympathetic character, as even though Frodo pleaded with Faramir not to hurt Smeagol, Faramir did not listen. All of this happens shortly after Smeagol managed to suppress the Gollum persona, and at this point in the story, Smeagol was being entirely cooperative with Frodo. It is this moment that causes Gollum to re-emerge and prompts Gollum to form a plan to get his revenge and retrieve his precious. And so having Frodo inadvertently cause Gollum severe physical pain, as well as emotional pain, only assists in telling their story. The only downside to this scene that I can think of is that some people may consider the violence excessive, and that it is perhaps inappropriate for a heroic character like Faramir to be behaving in this manner.
This was referred to as the Clockwork Orange sequence. I was always worried that it was possibly a little too much violence, and I'm glad that Faramir didn't involve himself in any of the violence. I think the purists would have been totally up in arms.
So here are all of the additional shots of violence played back to back. This is extremely brief, and had this scene devolved into a full-on torture and interrogation session, then I might agree that it is too much. But as it is, I think this scene is a clear improvement over the original version. Additionally, Faramir and his men will have no clue what Gollum is, other than that he looks all funky, and given that they are extremely paranoid about Sauron spying on them,
there are no travellers in this land, only servants of the Dark Tower.
It makes complete sense for the Rangers to abuse Gollum in this manner. I am going to place the Forbidden Pool in A. The Glittering Caves is up next. In the theatrical edition, we see the women and children taking refuge in the caves, whilst the men and boys are taken to defend the fortress. This is very brief and exists only to establish where the women and children are going to be during the battle. The extended edition instead shows us that Aragorn is not taking any downtime, and despite having just arrived after very nearly dying, he is still taking on a leadership role.
We will place the reserves along the wall and support the archers from above the gate.
Before Legolas tells him to rest. This is very brief, but is purposeful with regard to Aragorn's qualities as a leader, as it shows him putting the people of Rohan before himself. This also comes very shortly after he asks Theoden to send riders to Gondor, and Theoden refuses, which also suggests that Aragorn is trying to make the best of a bad situation, and he believes that if he rests, the defences may well be lacking. Now we come to Éowyn, and the primary changes this scene brings with it. Éowyn has sought out Aragorn to complain about the fact that she has been ordered to go into the caves with the other women. She believes there is no renown in this, which plays off of her earlier scene where she told Aragorn that she feared she would grow old within a metaphorical prison and forget any youthful dreams of valor. She believes that looking after the children and finding food and bedding for the men is not the best way she can be of use. However, there is a little bit more to it than that, as we are about to learn. This scene is significant for Éowyn's relationship with Aragorn. In the theatrical edition, she obviously likes him, but that's about it. To call their relationship any kind of romance would absolutely be a stretch, although you can very reasonably infer that Éowyn is romantically interested in Aragorn up to a point, which is later confirmed in both versions of The Return of the King.
Why have you come?
Do you not know?
It is but a shadow and a thought that you love. I cannot give you what you seek.
What we get in the theatrical edition is that they bond when he reassures her that her fate is not to grow old and die without valor. They joke about dwarf women having beards behind Gimli's back. She discovers that Aragorn is single. She is devastated when Gimli tells her that Aragorn has fallen, and is then very happy to see that he has not actually died, and she notices Legolas returning the Evenstar to Aragorn, and although she is still happy that he is not dead, her face drops and she appears to acknowledge that Aragorn is not as single as she would have hoped. Later, in The Return of the King, she appears surprised that Aragorn doesn't realize that she has feelings for him, and Aragorn then tells her that he cannot give her what she seeks. In the extended edition, her interest in him is far more developed and explicit. She is fascinated by the skill Aragorn displays when he calms Brego. They bond when she talks about growing old, they joke about ladybeards, she brings him some stew, they discuss his history, including his age, she discovers that Aragorn is single, sad when she thinks he is dead, happy when he is alive, apparently accepting when she sees Legolas return the Evenstar to him, and then in this scene, Éowyn begs Aragorn to let her fight at his side, and then she lets slip that she loves him.
You do not command the others to stay. They fight beside you because they would not be parted from you, because they love you.
The way she phrases this, by comparing her love for Aragorn to Legolas and Gimli's love for Aragorn, suggests that this is not strictly romantic. Because I am not one of those perverts who imagines platonic relationships depicted in films are actually laden with the gay, it may surprise you to learn that I do not believe that whenever we cut away to Sam and Frodo, Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli are indulging in the hedonistic pleasures of each other's rectums. Eowyn's intention here was presumably to address the perceived injustice of Legolas and Gimli staying of their own accord because of their brotherly love for Aragorn, whereas she is not permitted the same. The difference, of course, is that in the case of Eowyn, she does very clearly want to ride Aragorn's giggle stick, and so her love for him carries with it different implications, and the reason she apologizes is that she realizes what she just said, and that she is out of line as she knows at this point that Aragorn belongs to another. The main thing that is lost with this scene's removal is that Eowyn does not protest at all at being sent into the caves, which might seem slightly odd given that she did protest when she was asked to lead the people to Helm's Deep prior to the Warg attack. I do think it is absolutely appropriate and in character for Eowyn to protest these orders, in particular because it better contextualizes the decisions that she makes in The Return of the King. The addition of this conversation about her wanting to fight alongside the man she loves definitely makes Eowyn seem somewhat less mature, and somewhat more like a giddy schoolgirl falling head over heels for the handsome, rugged octogenarian who is very obviously not interested in her glittering cave.
We didn't really want to also put Eowyn quite in such a definitive place with Aragorn in this movie. It was something that we felt in the end would be better to leave for film 3.
That she's sort of completely in love with him. I mean, you think this scene goes too far
yes,
to reveal
I do.
that?
Yeah.
However, the fact that she lets this slip and then apologizes does still line up with the previous scene involving the Evenstar. It is not presented as though Eowyn acknowledged that Aragorn was not interested and then consciously decided to continue pursuing him. It is instead depicted as though she accidentally lets this slip before realizing what she has just said. These changes to their relationship aren't necessarily better or worse than in the theatrical edition, they are just different. And I like the fact that she asks Aragorn to let her stand at his side, and her accidentally confessing her feelings for him when she is already in a very emotional state is entirely coherent with the character as seen in the rest of the film.
This is a scene that we decided for pacing reasons, really, more than anything, not to include in the theatrical version. I guess we felt that it got in the way a little bit of the build-up to the battle.
Whether or not this needs to be in the film is a different question, however, and I find myself leaning towards the bottom of B tier because it isn't a strict improvement and it does slightly prolong the build-up to the Helm's Deep battle. This next change is a short scene that takes place during the Ent moot. Pippin is asleep, Treebeard and the other Ents are having a chat, and Merry says,
"It's been going for hours."
They must have decided something by now.
Treebeard then tells the hobbits that they have just finished saying good morning.
But it's night time already.
And Treebeard tells Merry, don't be hasty. This scene doesn't particularly advance their subplot, and it doesn't contain any information that is not present in other scenes. It also detracts from the otherwise extremely effective and intense build-up at Helm's Deep by cutting away. As a reminder, here is part of Peter Jackson's rationale for cutting the previous extended scene with Eowyn and Aragorn.
I guess we felt that it got in the way a little bit of the build-up to the battle.
His priority was to focus the film on the people of Rohan preparing for the inevitable battle, rather than disrupting this with unrelated character drama. I understand that decision, but then adding in scenes like this immediately afterwards makes me question the logic, because this cutaway with Treebeard does far more damage to the build-up of the Helm's Deep sequence than the Eowyn and Aragorn scene.
I do think it's very funny when he says we've only just finished saying good morning.
The comedy in this scene is also inappropriate given the context, as the idea that it takes the Ents an entire day to say good morning is ridiculous, as it makes verbal communication virtually redundant. This scene's saving grace is that it is only 50 seconds long, but as we learn that the Ents take for fucking ever to do anything in a subsequent scene,
we never say anything unless it's worth taking a long time to say.
This scene itself feels entirely unnecessary. This isn't comparable to another notable moment of comedy that occurs during the prelude to Helm's Deep.
The time I get this adjusted.
This particular joke can be summed up as, haha, Gimli's proportions are different, but the reason this joke doesn't feel like tonal whiplash is because of where the joke is placed. This is a brief moment of levity immediately after Legolas has apologized to Aragorn, and immediately prior to the arrival of Haldir and the elves. And so the tone of this scene is much less serious and intense than the surrounding scenes. Had the writers decided to place the Gimli joke here instead,
then I shall die as one of them.
The time I get this adjusted.
then the problem becomes very clear. If you are going to interrupt the prelude to Helm's Deep, please do it to build and develop your characters rather than for silly comedy. The decision to cut in a brief scene of lol, the trees are really slow at talking in between scenes of children arming themselves before they are inevitably slaughtered is definitely a detriment to the pacing and tone of the film, and so this scene absolutely goes in D. During the Battle of the Hornburg, we get a trimmed sequence of violence that is so brief that the YouTube gods have decided that I can just play it for you. This change was almost certainly made due to violence, which, again, I will draw your attention to Aragorn's fight with Lurt to highlight why this makes very little sense to me. But evidently, certain shots are deemed to be excessive by the ratings boards in specific countries, and I will never understand why. There are a handful of very brief moments throughout the trilogy where Peter Jackson removed shots of violence for the theatrical release, which may seem strange, given that in the UK and in the USA, the trilogy maintains the same age rating regardless of which version you watch. However, this decision was likely made so that the studio could distribute the same film globally, rather than issuing a more and less violent theatrical cut to specific countries in order to appease local censorship laws. Specifically, Denmark, Finland, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, Brazil, and New Zealand all apply a higher age rating to the extended edition than they did the theatrical edition, very likely due to these additional shots of violence. This, to me, is very weird, because for some reason these ratings boards consider Aragorn chopping off an Uruk-Hai's leg to be too much, but all of this is a-okay. Speaking of, there is another additional shot that lasts a grand total of 1 second. Are you ready? This will have been removed for exactly the same reason, because showing blood can absolutely heighten the intensity of battle or fight sequences, and the producers and studio will not have wanted to distribute multiple versions of the film, and so the globally released theatrical edition therefore had to comply with censorship laws in Finland, for example. I understand the reasons for doing this, but I don't have to like it. I am also going to bundle in one minuscule change to a later scene, the breaching of the Deeping Wall, in which we have a split-second shot of an Uruk being decapitated that is absent in the theatrical edition. And here is the shot of that decapitation at full speed. These extremely brief additional shots of violence make the battle sequence more visceral, more impactful, and more intense, and they should not have been removed. They are going in A tier. In the theatrical edition, we have an establishing shot of Fangorn that is not present in the extended edition, which actually makes this the rare example of the extended edition trimming out some Fangorn footage. The extended edition instead cuts directly to the Entmoot. However, the extended edition then draws out the pauses in the subsequent dialogue exchange by a few extra seconds, so I guess it isn't all good news. There is also a very slight tweak to the dialogue.
Oh, yes, it affects us all. Tree, root, and twig.
These changes are very small, and the overall runtime of both versions of the scene is virtually identical, which means that there isn't really any notable difference in how the scenes affect the pacing of the action at Helm's Deep. In the extended edition, Peter Jackson decided to trim the establishing shot in order to allow time for Treebeard to finish his sentence and to allow for the conversation between Treebeard and the hobbits to be slightly slower in delivery. This is the first change in the extended edition that doesn't actually add anything to the film, in that there is no new character information, world building, or comedy, for example. What it does instead is that it very slightly rearranges what was already present. Overall, I don't have strong feelings on this scene. I don't think one is clearly better than the other, so I'm gonna drop it in C tier. Next up, during the retreat to the Hornburg sequence, there are two small changes at the gate of Helm's Deep. Again, both will have been trimmed for violence. The extended edition shows this poor fucker getting yanked back into the gate, which implies that he has actually been impaled on the end of the battering ram, and this implication of impalement, I guess, makes this sequence too intense for the people of Finland. This is a quick moment of superficial violence that, as in previous examples, heightens the intensity at the cost of a second or two, and so this is absolutely a worthy trade-off. Moments later, an Uruk reaches through the breached gate and grabs Gamling by the throat before Theoden chops his arm off. Once again, dismemberment is absolutely fine in the theatrical edition of The Lord of the Rings, provided that the character's name is Lurtz. Anyway, this moment does do a little bit more than simply dial up the intensity. It shows that Theoden puts himself in danger to save Gamling, whilst both of them are putting themselves in danger to brace the gate. The way this plays out in the theatrical edition is that Theoden tries to help his men, and he gets speared as a result. In the extended edition, Theoden tries to brace the gate, Gamling is grabbed, Theoden then rescues Gamling, and the way this is cut together suggests that by rescuing Gamling, Theoden is caught off guard and speared, at which point he retreats. This is a small character moment for Theoden that was unfortunately sacrificed because the people of Denmark have arbitrary rules about what kinds of dismemberments are permissible. As with the previous trimmed moments of violence during the Helm's Deep sequence, these ones go in A tier. There isn't any kind of downside to including them, they're not excessive, and this time around we even get a character moment in the form of Theoden rescuing Gamling. So this next change occurs as Faramir and the hobbits approach Osgiliath. I am not going to rank this change on the tier list because it isn't a structural change to the film. This is simply an alteration to a shot using visual effects. But I still want to highlight how fucking weird this is. In the theatrical edition, this is the shot that we see. Now I'm going to flip between the two, and you tell me if you can spot the difference.
Osgiliath burns.
So, they straight up deleted Minas Tirith for the theatrical release. What possible reason would they have to do this? My guess was that they didn't delete Minas Tirith, rather they forgot to add it. Some oversight in the visual effects department caused them to forget that Minas Tirith should have been visible in this shot, given the direction that the camera is pointing, and so they remedied this mistake for the extended edition. This kind of thing is not abnormal, as the infamous shot of a car in the Shire was of course removed using visual effects for the home release. Unfortunately, for this shot of Minas Tirith, this turned out to not be the case.
We found that people at New Line got very confused between Osgiliath, which is ultimately where Faramir is heading with Frodo, and Helm's Deep.
Yeah, fair enough.
That there was a sort of a geography problem. Now, if you look at the back of the shot that's coming up here, you'll see Minas Tirith against the mountain. And we actually removed that from the theatrical version because people at New Line saw it and thought that Minas Tirith was Helm's Deep and thought that these people were approaching Helm's Deep.
So, pardon me, but what the fuck? These films have gone out of their way to show very clear geography. The filmmakers even went back and added shots of maps when cutting the film together because they wanted to ensure that the world was depicted as clearly as possible. Plus the fact that Rohan and Gondor are incredibly visually distinct locations, plus the fact that Minas Tirith and Helm's Deep look abso-fucking-lutely nothing like each other. So it is very slightly disheartening to hear that the executives at New Line saw Minas Tirith and either misunderstood the original cut of the film, or they were worried that the audience may misunderstand it. This is like being confused when the Fellowship arrived at Lothlorien because you aren't paying attention and you see elves, and so you wonder how the elf place that you saw earlier managed to teleport to the other side of Moria. This is like being confused as to why Legolas has just arrived at Helm's Deep with an army of elves, because Legolas is already here. Why are there now 2 Legolai, Peter? Why? This is like being confused that there being 2 separate evil towers in Middle-earth, and sometimes the Eye of Sauron is up there, and sometimes it's just not there, because it's sleeping or something. All of these misunderstandings can only come about if you are not watching the movie, and it is sad to see that Peter Jackson decided to change the theatrical edition to appease morons who weren't paying attention. Next is a small change during the last march of the Ents. After realizing Saruman's treachery, Merry notices that the trees are moving, and Treebeard tells him that they have business with the orcs. These other trees we see are not Ents, these are the Huorns that are only present in the extended edition. This is the setup for a future extended change, where the Huorns attack the Uruk-Hai as they retreat from Helm's Deep. The way this is structured appears to suggest that the Huorns responded to Treebeard's battle cry and decided to move to Helm's Deep to help the people of Rohan. They will have known about Saruman's army as it marched right past them, and so following the army is not at all out of the question. This acts as a setup to a later extended scene which does not exist in the theatrical edition, which means that this scene would serve no purpose without this later payoff, and so the quality and function of the payoff will entirely dictate whether or not this scene is worth including, so let's cover the payoff and then rank both at once. The payoff for the line about the horns is that Fangorn comes to Helm's Deep. We see that the forest of Fangorn has marched to Helm's Deep, consisting presumably of a combination of Huorns and Ents. Eomer warns to keep away from the trees, the forest waits until the Uruks are all inside, and then Fangorn Forest takes its revenge upon the Uruk-Hai. I don't like this scene. I don't like thinking about an army of trees running across Rohan looking to curb stomp some orcs. I don't like how the Uruk-Hai just kind of run into this forest without appearing to notice that the forest was not there previously. I don't like how it must have taken some time for the forest to arrive, which means that during much of the Battle of Helm's Deep, just slightly off-screen, there were a load of trees marching over the horizon and waiting for the Uruk-Hai to come to them. I don't like the fact that a forest arrived and no character noticed. I also find the inclusion of the Huorns entirely unnecessary, as by this point the Uruk army has been soundly defeated, scattered, divided, and leaderless, you could say, and so they do not need to be finished off in this manner. The thematic component of nature taking its revenge on Saruman for his selfish industrialization and his destroying the beauty of his own home is functional, but already exists in the theatrical edition, as the Ents destroying Isengard already serves precisely this purpose.
The moving forest was always a very difficult concept, and we ultimately left it out of the theatrical version, but anybody who's read the book, it's one of the most key sort of climactic moments of Helm's Deep is when the forest actually arrives at Helm's Deep. And so we did originally plan to put it in the film, and as we put it back in here in the extended cut, but we just felt that it was one thing too much for the theatrical version. The Ents marching on Isengard was really, we wanted to simplify it down to that.
So overall, I have to place both of these extended changes in D. They don't add anything that wasn't already present, and the logistics of a bloodthirsty forest running across the plains of Rohan is something that may have worked in the books, but is just too absurd for me to take seriously. Now, this one I have a feeling may be controversial. The final tally. Let's go piece by piece. Legolas tells Gimli that his final kill count is 42. As I have mentioned in at least one of my previous videos, this does not make a lick of sense. The time it takes from the first volley of arrows, which is the earliest possible time that Legolas could have gotten a kill, to his claim to Gimli that he has achieved 17 kills, is approximately 90 seconds. And yet we are expected to believe that in the entire subsequent battle, a battle against an army numbering well over 10,000, and a battle that supposedly lasts through the night until dawn, Legolas only achieved a further 25 kills. Of course, none of this matters in the slightest, because this is entirely in service of a character moment between Legolas and Gimli, but I have no idea why his kill count was written to be 42 instead of 442. This number may sound ridiculous, but across both the Lord of the Rings and Hobbit trilogies, Legolas has a grand total of 230 on-screen kills. And so the idea that such an incredibly proficient fighter could kill hundreds in a single battle, if we are accounting for off-screen kills, which of course we are, then I think a number in the hundreds is entirely reasonable. Either way, 42 is an absurdly small number. Gimli then responds that he is sitting on his 43rd kill, which is also an absurdly low number. Gimli is almost certainly lying to Legolas here, as at the start of the battle, Gimli was on 2 kills when Legolas was on 17, and if we are going to accept that Legolas only managed a further 25 kills across the night, then there is no way that Gimli should have been able to achieve 41, and so he appears to be pretending that he outscored Legolas. Anyway, the Uruk Gimli is sitting on twitches, Legolas shoots it, and claims it as his 43rd kill. Gimli contests that the kill is his, and that the reason the corpse was twitching was because
he's got my axe embedded in his nervous system!
This moment recalls a similar line of dialogue earlier in the film that appears in both versions.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
In both cases, these phrases seem to be anachronistic in that they do not belong in the setting. The reason these phrases were chosen was because they are immediately understandable, but they have the potential to damage the setting by making it less coherent, less immersive, and less believable. So to set the stage, let's tackle meats back on the menu first. This brings to mind a rather ridiculous image of a group of orcs sitting at a restaurant. I would have preferred that the orcs used different terminology, but the reason why I don't consider meats back on the menu to be quite as problematic, however, is because restaurants, and therefore menus, do exist within Middle-earth. And so it is not entirely unreasonable that an orc might be aware of what a menu is, regardless of the fact that the orcs would not use menus. Now onto the nervous system gag. This brings to mind images of Gimli in a lab coat studying the effects different levels of trauma can have on the brain. However, this level of absurdity is not actually necessary for this gag to function without breaking immersion. If we discard the specific phrase that Gimli uses, then the understanding that Gimli needs to have, and the science required for this joke to function, is that when his axe is inside the skull of an enemy, it can cause muscle spasms and twitching, as seen here. Gimli is a hardened and experienced warrior, and so it is absolutely reasonable for him to have noticed that corpses sometimes twitch when he moves his axe. This is purely an observation that anyone in the setting could make, and it does not rely on Middle-earth having a flourishing institute of neurology. Which means we are now left with his choice of words, and this is somewhat harder to defend. So to help me, I'm going to have to engage maximum autism. The setting of Middle-earth is approximately analogous to medieval Europe, placing it somewhere in a rather broad era stretching from the 5th to the 15th century, which lines up with most technology seen in the films, such as Saruman's weaponization of gunpowder and the various siege weapons we see in the battle sequences. The most advanced technology in the setting appears to come from Saruman, with his industrialization and creation of a war machine being an obvious parallel to the Industrial Revolution that occurred between approximately 1760 and 1840, and so Saruman's mass production of weapons and armor in this manner, plus his creation of gunpowder, is clearly intended to be a progression to the technology level of all other factions in Middle-earth. So how does the phrase nervous system fit into this approximate time frame? Avicenna, often described as the father of modern medicine, is quoted as saying, "Sensation and movement are sometimes conveyed to a member through one single nerve, sometimes through several nerves. In each case, the nerve is the source of power. There are structures arising from the brain of spinal cord. They are white, soft, pliant, difficult to tear, and were created to subserve sensation and movement of the limbs." Avicenna died in 1037, which places this knowledge well within the approximate analogous era of Middle-earth. So it seems the idea of Middle-earth having any kind of comprehension as to what a nervous system is not anywhere near as absurd as I had initially thought. It was known and accepted during medieval times that these things called nerves are responsible for creating movement and feeling within the body. And importantly, this understanding does not necessitate a comprehensive understanding of how the brain actually works. The discovery of what would become known as the nervous system can in fact be dated all the way back to ancient Greece. Nervous system sounds like very modern terminology, but this phrase appearing in Middle-earth is not as out of place as I had initially understood. Neither the menu reference nor the nervous system reference are anywhere near as catastrophic as if Gimli had instead said, "Come on, Legolas, it's not rocket science," as this aphorism relies entirely upon the existence of rockets. They could have very easily fixed what is widely understood to be an anachronism, however, by having Gimli instead say, "He's got my axe embedded in his noggin."
This scene probably qualifies as just about the most painful deletion from the movie, doesn't it? Everybody wanted this scene to be in the film, except there was just an organic kind of flow of momentum at the end that didn't allow room for this. But it's very, very funny. I love the way that the guys play this moment.
In spite of its flaws, I do enjoy this scene a lot because of the purpose it serves, the bonding and playful rivalry between Legolas and Gimli, which also acts as a very minor payoff for the kill counting established earlier. I would have preferred that Gimli use different terminology, but given that this is not actually as out of place as I initially believed, the main problem with this scene is the ridiculousness of their kill tallies. The reason for these kill tallies being 42 and 43 is presumably as a direct reference to the book, although the book actually specifies that Gimli achieved 42 and Legolas achieved 41. Either way, the problem here is that there is a tremendous difference between reading about a large battle on a piece of paper and seeing tens of thousands of Uruk-Hai assaulting Helm's Deep. Because of the immense scale of the battle, as seen in the film, it becomes totally ridiculous for Legolas and Gimli to have only achieved 42 and 43 kills. So, put simply, I don't care that these are the numbers that appear in the book, because by dropping in a little reference to the book, the writers have created a head-scratching moment of ridiculousness. Because the number of kills they get is unimportant to the narrative and only facilitates some character bonding and comedy, I am not going to be too harsh on this scene. That said, if their kill numbers were higher by an order of magnitude, and if Gimli had used different terminology, then this scene would be an easy B or possibly A tier because of how strong these characters are in the extended edition. But I am going to have to place the final tally in C tier. Immediately after the final count, we have another brand new scene, Flotsam and Jetsam. This scene shows us the aftermath of the Ents' attack on Isengard, which we do not see in the theatrical versions until the start of the Return of the King. Now, some of my rankings may have given off the impression that I am a bit of a buzzkill, as I have tended to be very harsh towards comedic scenes that serve little other purpose. However, this scene, I think, is mostly a resounding success. Merry and Pippin mock Saruman from a distance.
He doesn't look too happy, does he? Not too happy at all, Merry.
Merry then covertly checks to see if he is taller than Pippin again after the events of the Ent Draft scene, and he is happy to see that the world is back to normal. Pippin says he is starving and, oh look, floating food. Holy shit, we're next to a storage room. Holy shit, it's fully stocked. Holy shit, they have pipeweed. Pippin asks if they should share it with Treebeard, and Merry replies,
"No, dead plant and all that.
A confused Treebeard approaches the storage room while the hobbits get baked out of their minds before we cut to the next scene. So firstly, the logistics of what happens. This requires that Isengard still has a very well-stocked storeroom even after Saruman's destructive industrialization, including the spawning of tens of thousands of Uruk-Hai. My immediate question was, how on earth does this storeroom still exist? But Merry does actually say in disbelief that this is Saruman's storeroom. He could be just guessing, but I think the most coherent explanation is that this is indeed Saruman's personal storeroom, containing supplies intended for himself, and only for himself. The alternative explanation is that the Uruk-Hai and orcs regularly eat apples and lettuce, which is about the least orky thing I can think of. So if this is indeed Saruman's personal storeroom, then presumably the orcs knew not to go near it, otherwise it would not be in the state it is currently in. So yeah, it is lucky that the hobbits found themselves standing next to Saruman's storeroom, but as all this facilitates is a joke, and as this does not affect the narrative in the slightest, I don't consider this convenience to be a problem in the slightest. Now, onto the comedy. There are multiple jokes in this scene. The hobbits mocking Saruman whilst complimenting how nice a place Isengard is very funny because the hobbits are insulting Saruman in an extremely petty and inconsequential manner after they just convinced the Ents to obliterate his entire operation and ruin his evil plans. Saying he doesn't look too happy after ruining an evil wizard's plans for world domination is just about the most hobbity thing I can think of. It is, of course, the mother of all understatements, and it is totally appropriate for the hobbits to say this. Next up, Merry covertly checking to make sure he is taller than Pippin, as he was prior to the Ent Draft scene, is fine, I guess. It is a little exaggerated and clownish, but as the timing of this scene is excellent, which was absolutely not the case with the Ent Draft scene, I don't have quite the same criticisms of it. Next up, the gradual realization that they are standing next to Saruman's storeroom, complete with 2 full barrels of pipeweed, is a case of surprise good luck leading to a moment of catharsis. This works because the hobbits accidentally find exactly what they want, and they can't believe their luck, and because it is not narratively important for them to find 2 barrels of pipeweed. This is not a case of the writers reaching into the film, taking the wheel, and steering the characters in the direction that they would like. This is a case of the writers placing Merry and Pippin in an unlikely but entirely possible scenario to serve purely as a comedic and cathartic payoff at the end of the film, and as a reward for their heroism. If we were to tweak this scene and have Pippin discover Saruman's palantir in this storeroom, the palantir of course being extremely narratively important in The Return of the King, then I would criticize the piss out of this, because that hypothetical scene would instead be the writers making Pippin accidentally find a plot device, because I guess it was just kind of there, and because the writers didn't think of a better way to get it into Pippin's hands. Point being, there is a difference between good luck, or a convenience, being used to facilitate a joke, and being used as a way to get the story going, because the writers didn't have any better ideas. And finally, the joke about the hobbits not wanting to explain to Treebeard that they are smoking a dead plant is very funny, because it is based on their approximate understanding of Treebeard. They have no idea what Treebeard would actually think, but the logical through line of Treebeard equals plant, pipeweed equals plant, therefore pipeweed equals Treebeard's distant relative, is both coherent and extremely funny. This also doesn't present any kind of moral conundrum, as the films have been quite clear that the Ents and the Horns are sentient, not that all plant life is sentient. As Merry doesn't particularly want to share the pipeweed with him, he gives a very amusing and understandable reason as to why they shouldn't tell Treebeard. Although, that said, seeing Treebeard getting zonked on old Toby does sound rather amusing.
Now, this again is of course true to the book, because they did actually discover Saruman's
Well, I love the whole
storehouse.
pipe smoking backstory in the book. You know how Saruman tells Gandalf off for smoking his pipe, but he's really secretly got a stash of pipeweed himself. Oh, and it was because Gandalf started smoking pipeweed that Saruman was sort of envious of Gandalf's kind of liberalism, and he got pipeweed to try it out for himself, but kept it secret. So Isengard's kind of like full of all this pipeweed from the Shire that Saruman has secretly smuggled in there.
So in conclusion, why does the Flotsam and Jetsam extended scene, a scene that is almost entirely dedicated to Merry and Pippin dicking about, work in a way that the previous one did not? I'll ignore the fact that I find this scene much funnier than the Ent Draft scene, and I will try to be as objective as I can. Firstly, at this point in the story, the hobbits have earned this moment. They are kicking back after a hard day's work defeating Saruman. They have accomplished something ridiculous that no one, other than Gandalf I guess, could have possibly predicted. They are also in a safe location, as Pippin proudly declares in The Return of the King.
We are sitting on a field of victory, enjoying a few well-earned comforts.
It therefore makes complete sense for the hobbits to do what they do in this scene. Conversely, the Ent Draft scene occurs when the hobbits are alone in the middle of a spooky forest that they have been told is dangerous. They also had not accomplished anything at that point in the story, and so them kicking back and acting like children is instead damaging to their characters rather than complimentary. And secondly, the Flotsam and Jetsam scene is placed at the end of the Two Towers, at the conclusion of their subplot. It provides some levity and closure after they have accomplished their goal in spectacular fashion, and allows them to enjoy themselves, which, outside of the Ent Draft scene, is not something they have been able to do since play fighting with Boromir in the Fellowship of the Ring. This scene also goes on for about 2 minutes, and does not outstay its welcome in the same way that the Ent Draft scene did. So I know that this scene is not narratively important, and I know that its purpose is to make us laugh, and I know that it doesn't really accomplish anything else. However, I very much enjoy this scene, and I think of it in a similar way to how I think of the Concerning Hobbits extended scene. The content is excellent, however I can absolutely understand why it was removed, and so Flotsam and Jetsam is going to be placed in B. The final extended scene in The Two Towers is Farewell to Faramir. This is the third new scene that is inserted after the conclusion of the Battle of Helm's Deep. The theatrical edition takes about 4 minutes to wrap things up, whereas the extended edition takes over 10 minutes.
One of the problems of having multiple storylines is that you sort of tended to want to wrap each of them up. We did film these little conclusions to each of the storylines and felt that we didn't really need any of them in the theatrical version.
In the theatrical edition, Faramir orders that Frodo, Sam and Gollum be released, and we then have the final scene of the film where Sam wonders if anyone will ever tell stories about them. In the extended edition, we have an additional interaction with Faramir before they leave Osgiliath. Faramir leads them through the city to the sewer so that they can escape. Sam then tells Faramir,
Captain Faramir, you've shown your quality, sir.
Which is a callback both to the Sons of the Steward scene as well as the scene in which Faramir almost takes the ring from Frodo. Sam was, of course, present for this, and so him thanking Faramir and assuring him that, by letting them go instead of taking the ring, he has shown his quality by defying his father and resisting the corruption of the ring, which is a fantastic bookend for the character of Faramir in The Two Towers. Faramir then repays the compliment.
Shire must truly be a great realm, Master Gamgee, where gardeners are held in high honour.
He then asks Frodo what road he plans to take into Mordor, and this is where we get a slight deviation from the theatrical edition. In the theatrical edition, the hobbits know that there is another way into Mordor. The extended edition elaborates and specifies that Gollum has told the hobbits that there is a pass near Minas Morgul that climbs into the mountains. When Frodo tells Faramir of this, Gollum attempts to slink away from Faramir, fearing that he will be beaten further, which also suggests to the audience that Gollum is up to something, before this is confirmed a couple of minutes later. Faramir, knowing the surrounding area very well, is alarmed by this, and so he grabs Gollum by the throat. Gollum is clearly in a lot of pain throughout this sequence as a result of the beating he received in the Forbidden Pool extended scene. He is also further abused by Faramir in this scene, which is interesting because Faramir doesn't have quite the same reasons for doing this that he had in the Forbidden Pool scene. His reasons for treating Gollum in this way can only really be explained by the fact that he is extremely suspicious of Gollum, plus the fact that Gollum looks like Gollum. He absolutely sees Gollum as an evil creature that should not be trusted. However, he does allow Gollum to leave with them, as Frodo has explained that Gollum's help is vital in completing his quest. Anyway, Faramir warns Frodo of a dark terror that dwells in the passes above Minas Morgul, which of course foreshadows Shelob. This is entirely in character for Faramir to do, and the fact that this scene shows us that he is very actively invested in Frodo's safety, rather than simply releasing and forgetting about him, is excellent. However, from a storytelling perspective, this is not entirely necessary, as the audience will receive the Shelob foreshadowing again in the very next scene.
Smeagol?
Do it.
Each of these references to Shelob functions well as a cliffhanger leading into the return of the king. However, accomplishing the same thing twice within the space of a couple of minutes feels somewhat pointless. The difference that this scene's inclusion makes, however, is that Frodo and Sam also receive this foreshadowing of Shelob, whereas in the theatrical edition, they do not hear Gollum's conversation with himself. This means that Frodo and Sam know that there is something specific to be afraid of in the mountain pass near Minas Morgul, and yet this is not brought up again until they have arrived at Minas Morgul.
Hey, what's in this tunnel?
Adolf Hitler.
It is odd that immediately after learning that there is a dark terror near Minas Morgul, Sam then has a casual chat with Gollum where he reassures him that Frodo did not mean for the Rangers to hurt him. This is a bit strange, because Sam is suspicious of Gollum throughout the entire trilogy, and Faramir has just told him that there is a dark terror in the past that Gollum intends to lead them through, and instead of being like,
"What the fuck?"
he is instead like, "Hey Gollum, I hope you're doing okay, no hard feelings about being beaten up." I think the explanation for this is that at this point in the extended edition, Sam is far more accepting of Gollum, and so the fact that there is a dark terror near Minas Morgul does not raise any red flags, at least not yet. Sam figures that Gollum is actually keeping his word, and that even if there is a dark terror in the mountain pass, they don't really have a choice, if this is indeed the only other way into Mordor. He also tries to establish a degree of trust and friendship with Gollum, something that is not really present in the theatrical edition. The nature of Sam's relationship with Gollum changes as a result of this extended scene. In the theatrical edition, Sam is repeatedly shown to be abusive and suspicious of Gollum, and it is extremely clear that he thinks Frodo's trust of Gollum is misplaced.
Let's just tie him up and leave him. If we let him go, he'll throttle us in our sleep. He's led us into a swamp. Why haven't you spoken of this before?
Mr. Frodo, no. No.
Hey, Stinker, don't go getting too far ahead.
However, he also develops some kind of functional relationship with Gollum.
We also wanted to show here that there's almost a workable relationship now emerging between Sam and Gollum, and even though they're bickering, there's kind of a level of good humour underneath it all.
Sam and Gollum do not interact while they are captured by Faramir, but at the end of the film, Sam calls out,
"Hey, Gollum!"
which is contrasted both with Frodo referring to Gollum in a much friendlier way as Smeagol, but is also contrasted with how Sam himself referred to Gollum earlier in the film.
Hey, Stinker!
All of this shows that, in the theatrical edition, Sam does not trust Gollum by the end of The Two Towers. He is still absolutely on guard, and he is very aware of what Gollum is and what he wants. In the extended edition, things are slightly different. He is further shown to be disgusted and frustrated by Gollum's eating habits and general behaviour, showing him absolutely no sympathy. He eventually develops a semi-functional relationship with Gollum, as in the theatrical edition, but then in this extended scene at the end of the film, Sam tells Gollum that Frodo didn't mean for the Rangers to hurt him, and when Gollum agrees no hard feelings, Sam says,
It's very decent of you. Very decent indeed, Gollum.
Which is by far the nicest thing he says to Gollum in either version of the film. This stands out against the theatrical edition because it shows quite clearly that at this point in the extended edition, Sam is very willing to at least try to be friendly with Gollum. This, I think, is a marginal improvement over the theatrical edition, as the audience is shown that Sam has come to trust Gollum, and then, moments later, the audience is shown that Sam absolutely should not be trusting Gollum.
It's a little bit of an olive branch, in a way, to make the fact that the one person who's always mistrusted Smeagol, the last thing you hear in this movie, has been Sam saying, "That's very decent of you, very decent indeed," which is like, no, Sam, don't, what are you doing? You can't trust this guy.
This, therefore, makes the cliffhanger ending slightly more effective because we come out of The Two Towers with the impression that Sam's guard is down, and that therefore they are in more danger than they were in the theatrical edition. Overall, the farewell to Faramir scene is great. It contains a lot of character information for all four of its characters, and the development of Sam's treatment of Gollum is excellent. The potential negatives are redundant storytelling in the form of doubling up the foreshadowing of Shelob, as well as raising the question as to why exactly Sam trusts Gollum after hearing about the Dark Terror. This is a scene that fleshes out what was already there. However, it is quite long, and it does draw out the conclusion of the film slightly more than was necessary. And the final scene of Frodo, Sam, and Gollum is still an excellent cliffhanger for The Two Towers without this scene's inclusion, and so I am going to drop this scene in B tier. Well, that brings us to the end of the extended edition of The Two Towers. Unlike The Fellowship of the Ring, which was a pretty clear improvement, The Two Towers is something of a mixed bag, containing some of the best and some of the worst extended scenes of the trilogy. We have 2 new scenes that expand on the properties of the ring, we have 7 that add to the world building of the setting, 1 that adds tension, 3 that add more action and or violence, and 1 that is simply a re-edit of an existing scene. There are 2 new scenes that provide setup to future events that occur in both versions of the film. One being Saruman's destruction of Fangorn Forest, the fact that Fangorn borders on Isengard, the building of a dam and the foreshadowing of the scale of his army, and the other being Aragorn's rescue by Brego. The following characters lost scenes of character development. Arwen lost 1, as did both Boromir and Denethor. Saruman lost 2, as did Eomer, Gimli, Legolas, Gandalf, and Treebeard. Wormtongue lost 3 scenes, as did Pippin. Sam lost 4 scenes, as did Frodo, Gollum, Merry, Theoden, and Éowyn. Faramir lost 5 scenes of character work, and once again, topping the list, Aragorn lost 6 scenes of character development. However, the characters that I consider to have the biggest improvements in the extended edition of The Two Towers when compared to the theatrical edition are Boromir, Faramir, and Denethor for obvious reasons. However, Theoden, Éowyn, and Aragorn also definitely lose out. Interestingly, the Uruk-Hai are also far better characterized in the extended edition, which helps the narrative as they are far more than just faceless evil monsters. Additionally, the relationship between Sam and Gollum is slightly better developed in the extended edition. Now on to a handful of things that are entirely absent in the extended edition. Saruman's conflict and competition with Sauron is only present in these extended scenes, whereas in the theatrical edition, he is depicted as a minion of Sauron who wants Sauron to take over Middle-earth. The subplot with the horns is completely absent. In the theatrical edition, we only get a very vague mention of the danger of Fangorn Forest, and that the Ents keep the trees in check. Éowyn's love for Aragorn is far more explicit in the extended edition, and the extended edition also acknowledges the fact that Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli do not actually ever rescue Merry and Pippin, and allows Gimli the opportunity to question why they are not going to continue searching for them. Much like the extended edition of The Fellowship of the Ring, there are multiple new scenes that offer comic relief. In The Fellowship of the Ring, my view was that virtually all of the added comedy was entirely functional and appropriate, with one exception. In The Two Towers, the comedy is much more of a mixed bag. Most of the added jokes are funny, and are drawn from the characterization of the characters in question, rather than forcing them to act out of character. The problem, in a lot of cases, is tonal inconsistency, usually in the form of comedic scenes being inserted at inappropriate times. In these scenes, the problem isn't necessarily the nature of the comedy, but where it is placed within the film. The worst offender is absolutely the Ent Draft scene. The jokes themselves are not really a problem, and the delivery is oftentimes still very funny, but it is inappropriate both for the characters to be acting in this way in this location, it is inappropriate for such a scene to go on for nearly 5 minutes, and it is inappropriate for it to be placed between two very dramatic scenes, namely the Black Gate and Éowyn telling Theoden that his son is dead. Which I guess means, now that I have dragged this out for far too long, I need to make a very difficult decision. I need to answer the title of the video. Which version of the film is actually better? If I were to cut together my perfect version of The Two Towers, I would obviously remove the Ent Draft scene, along with all 4 extended scenes involving Treebeard and the Horns. I would also cut the nice but pointless scene of Saruman learning Aragorn's supposed identity, as well as both extended scenes right at the start of the film. As much as it pains me, I would also cut out the final tally. Additionally, because there is no way to edit out the parts I like from the one of the Dunedain scene, that scene also has to go. That makes 10 extended scenes that I feel straight up detract from the extended edition, amounting to a total of 16 minutes. Which is approximately 1/3 of the total length of the additional footage. Now on to the changes that are absolutely an improvement. Sons of the Steward is one of the best scenes in The Lord of the Rings, and this fact is the main reason why it is so difficult for me to conclusively say which version of the film is better. Additionally, the Brego scene of Herbs and Stewed Rabbit, the window on the west, the passage of the Marshes, the Heir of Numenor, the Forbidden Pool, the Banishment of Eomer, and the White Rider all contain fantastic character work, world building, or important setup for future scenes. Additionally, there are 4 very minor changes to scenes amounting to a few seconds that do nonetheless improve the film. These changes add up to a total of 14.5 minutes, and the reason this number sounds quite low is that there are 5 extended changes that I placed in A tier that are less than 20 seconds long, and so whilst they are definite improvements, they are potentially not worth the trade-off when compared to the drawbacks posed by the multiple D-tier scenes that run for 2 minutes or longer. So, okay, those are the numbers, and that is the tier list. Now, how do I actually feel about each version of the film? I feel that most of the weaker extended changes are weak because they are too long. I feel that in particular during the second act of the film, the pacing is absolutely negatively affected in a significant way. I feel that there are a couple of changes that hurt certain payoffs later in the trilogy, and I feel that specifically the Fangorn subplot as a whole is weakened by these extended changes because it takes up far too much time. I feel that the absolute best extended scenes in the Two Towers are generally the ones relating to Faramir. However, I do not think that Faramir benefits quite as much as Boromir did from the extended scenes in the Fellowship of the Ring. So to finally answer the question of the video, prior to starting this video series I didn't think I would ever say this, but I think that when weighing up the pros and cons of each version of the film, the theatrical edition of The Two Towers is marginally superior as an overall film. However, whenever I rewatch The Two Towers, I will always choose the extended edition. I am able to overlook most of the flaws with the extended edition because of how incredibly good the rest of the film is. However, that does not mean that those flaws do not exist. Most of the weakest scenes in the extended edition are, at the very least, entertaining. The only damage that is done to either the characters or the setting is the Ent Draft scene where Merry and Pippin dick about when their lives are in danger, and the suggestion that Sam put Frodo in danger to save his box of chicken seasoning. Outside of that, all of the weaker scenes are primarily weak due to either redundancy or slowing down the pace of the film. And whilst pacing is a very important part of filmmaking, it is important to remember that many of the emotional payoffs of the film hit harder as a result of taking more time to properly develop these characters and their relationships. But anyway, that's just about all I've got for this one. The extended edition is probably slightly weaker, but I will always choose it over the theatrical edition because of how it fleshes out some of my favourite parts of the trilogy. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope my take on these extended scenes hasn't been too spicy, and I do hope that you have enjoyed listening to me talk about one of my favourite films. I will be doing the same thing for The Return of the King, so stay tuned. Additionally, if you have any suggestions for other films with extended or director's cuts that I should take a look at, feel free to drop them in the comments below. 2 quick plugs if you want to hop in my Discord or check out the second channel where I upload video game streams, as well as the music I write for these videos. The links are in the description. Thank you again for your time, and I will see you in my next video.